Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Imagine, if you will, a world where the sun has not been seen in living memory, not because the star that once warmed the cradle of humanity has gone dark, but because the sky itself has been choked by 10,000 years of industrial smoke, ash from continent-spanning wars, and the thick, suffocating haze of a civilization that has burned through its own future. This is Terra. This is Earth. Not the blue marble of oceans and green forests that you might picture when someone says the word home. No. This Terra is a hive of steel and stone, a planet-sized city whose foundations rest upon the bones of every civilization that humanity has ever built and then torn down again. Towers stretch so high into the polluted atmosphere that their upper spires punch through the cloud layer into a thin, freezing sky where the stars are visible only to those wealthy enough or powerful enough to live above the filth. And somewhere within this sprawling, impossible monument to both human ambition and human cruelty, there exists a structure so vast that it defies comprehension. The Imperial Palace. It covers entire continents. Its walls are mountains. Its corridors stretch for hundreds of miles, winding through cathedral halls large enough to hold entire cities within their vaulted ceilings. And deep within the heart of this palace, past layer upon layer of fortifications, checkpoints, sacred wards, and the watchful gaze of warriors whose golden armor gleams like captured sunlight, there sits a throne, the Golden Throne, and upon it, sustained by arcane technologies that no living soul fully understands, and held between life and death by the prayers of a million psychers who sacrifice themselves daily just to keep the light burning, sits the Emperor of mankind. He has been here for 10,000 years. He has not moved. He has not spoken, at least not in any way that ordinary humans can perceive. His body is a withered husk, a ruin of what was once the most magnificent physical form ever to walk among men. But his will endures, his power endures, and the golden warriors who stand eternal vigil around his broken form endure as well. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own. And tonight, we are going to talk about what it takes to become one of them. Now, when most people think about the superhuman warriors of the 41st millennium, their minds go immediately to the Space Marines, and that makes sense. The Adeptus Astartes are the face of the Imperium's military might, the poster children of war in a galaxy that knows nothing else. You see their angular helmets and their massive shoulder pads on every piece of artwork, every book cover, every promotional image. They are humanity's angels of death, 8 feet tall, clad in ceramite power armor, wielding weapons that would crush a normal person under their weight. They are impressive. They are terrifying. And compared to a custodian, they are merely adequate. That is not an insult to the Space Marines. It is simply the truth of what a custodian is. The lore tells us, in no uncertain terms, that a single custodian stands in relation to a Space Marine the way a Space Marine stands in relation to a common soldier of the Imperial Guard. Think about that for a moment. As a Space Marine can tear through a platoon of trained soldiers without breaking stride, a custodian can do the same to Space Marines. Not because they are simply bigger or stronger, though they are both of those things, but because every single aspect of their creation, from the very first moment of their transformation to the final breath of their impossibly long lives, is designed to produce something that exists on an entirely different level of capability. A Space Marine is mass-produced. That sounds harsh, and perhaps it is oversimplifying things, but the core truth remains. The process of creating a Space Marine, while brutal and dangerous, follows a relatively standardized template. You take an adolescent boy. You implant him with a series of gene seed organs derived from one of the 20 original Primarchs. You subject him to hypnotherapy and chemical conditioning. You encase him in power armor. And at the end of this process, which takes several years, you have a warrior who is faster, stronger, tougher, and more resilient than any baseline human could ever hope to be. The success rate is not high. Many aspirants die during the process, but enough survive to fill the ranks of 1,000 chapters, each 1,000 strong. A custodian is something else entirely. Where a space marine is a production line weapon, standardized and replicated across thousands of individuals, a custodian is a handcrafted masterpiece. Each one is unique. Each one is the product of a process so complex, so painstaking, and so deeply rooted in secrets that predate the Imperium itself, that the creation of even a single custodian represents an investment of resources and expertise that most planetary governors could not begin to comprehend. And unlike the Space Marines, whose creation begins in adolescence, the forging of a custodian must begin in infancy, not childhood, infancy, before the brain has fully formed, before the personality has had a chance to solidify, before the child even has the capacity to understand what is being done to them. This is the price of perfection, and it is a price that has been paid over and over again for more than 10,000 years. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us talk about where these golden warriors come from, why they exist, and what happens to a human infant when the most powerful genetic technologies ever devised by the human species are turned upon their still-forming flesh. Because to understand the Custodians, you have to understand the world that made them necessary. You have to go back to a time before the Imperium, before the Space Marines, before even the Thunder Warriors. You have to go back to the Age of Strife, when Terra was not the throne world of a galaxy-spanning empire, but a howling nightmare of tribal warfare, genetic experimentation, and slow, grinding apocalypse. And you have to understand the mind of the being who looked upon all of that suffering and decided that the only solution was to create something that had never existed before. Something that was more than human, but not less. Something that could stand beside a god and not be diminished by the comparison. Something golden. The story of the Custodians begins with the story of Old Earth, and Old Earth is a story of ruin. Long before the 30th millennium, long before the Emperor revealed himself to the warring tribes and techno-barbarian kingdoms that had carved terror into a patchwork of competing empires, humanity had reached heights of technological achievement that the 40th millennium can only dream of. This was the dark age of technology, a golden era when humanity's understanding of science and engineering had allowed them to colonize thousands of worlds, construct marvels of engineering that bordered on the miraculous, and develop artificial intelligences of staggering complexity. It was by all accounts a paradise, or at least as close to paradise as a species hardwired for conflict could ever come. But paradise does not last. It never does. The details of what went wrong are lost to time, buried under millennia of deliberate suppression and simple forgetfulness. What we know is that the great network of human civilization, spread across the galaxy and connected by faster-than-light travel through the dimension known as the warp, began to collapse. The warp itself became increasingly turbulent and hostile, making interstellar travel dangerous and eventually impossible. Worlds that had depended on trade and communication with other human settlements found themselves isolated and alone. The artificial intelligences that humanity had created turned against their makers in a conflict known as the cybernetic revolt. Alien races, sensing weakness, are pressed in from all sides. And the nascent stirring of a new chaos god, the being that would eventually be known as Slanesh, sent psychic shockwaves rippling through the fabric of reality that drove entire populations insane. Terra was not spared. The jewel of human civilization, the birthplace of the species, fell into an age of darkness that lasted for thousands of years. The great cities crumbled or were repurposed into fortress factories by the warlords who carved the planet into their personal domains. Technology that had once been commonplace became the jealously guarded province of those strong enough to seize it and ruthless enough to use it. Genetic experimentation, once conducted under the auspices of carefully regulated scientific institutions, was now performed in blood-stained laboratories by madmen and tyrants who used it to create armies of mutant soldiers twisted human slaves, and weapons of terrifying biological potency. This was the world that the Emperor inherited. A world of monsters and madmen, of techno-barbarian warlords who commanded armies of genetically altered warriors and wielded weapons from a more advanced age, with the subtlety of a child swinging a hammer. A world that had forgotten what unity felt like, where every nation, every city-state, every petty kingdom existed in a state of perpetual war with its neighbors, and where the concept of a shared human identity had been buried under millennia of tribal loyalty and survival at all costs mentality. The Emperor, whatever he truly was, whatever ancient power or accumulated human potential he represented, all looked upon this world and saw not just the suffering of the present, but the potential of the future. He had a vision, a grand, impossible, breathtakingly ambitious vision of a united humanity, free from the grip of superstition and alien influence, standing as the dominant species in a galaxy that cared nothing for their survival. And to achieve this vision, he needed warriors, but not just any warriors. The Emperor's first experiments in genetic enhancement produced the Thunder Warriors. These were massive, fearsome combatants, created from adult men who had been subjected to a process of alchemical augmentation and gene sculpting that transformed them into super soldiers of terrifying power. They were larger than the Space Marines, who would eventually replace them, stronger in many ways, and utterly ferocious in combat. During the Unification Wars that brought terror under the Emperor's rule, the Thunder Warriors were his primary military force, the sledgehammer that he used to crack open the fortress states and techno-barbarian kingdoms that resisted his authority. But the Thunder Warriors were flawed. Their creation process was imperfect, rushed, designed for short-term military expedience rather than long-term stability. Their bodies rebelled against the genetic changes only a few decades after the transformation. Many became mentally unstable. Their loyalty, while generally strong, was not the absolute, unquestioning devotion that the Emperor required from those who would stand at his side through the millennia of conflict that he foresaw. The Thunder Warriors were weapons built for a specific war, and when that war was over, the weapons were discarded. Officially, the histories record that the last Thunder Warriors fell at the Battle of Mount Ararat, the final engagement of the Unification Wars. The truth, whispered in the darkest corners of Imperial history, is that they were culled, put down like dangerous animals that had outlived their usefulness, and the ones who carried out that culling were the Custodians, because the Custodians existed before the Thunder Warriors, before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs were even a gleam in the Emperor's geneticist's eye. The Legio Custodes, as they were known during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, were the Emperor's first and most personal creation. They were his companions, his bodyguards, his confidants, and when necessary, his executioners. Where the Thunder Warriors were created to wage war, the Custodes were created to stand beside a god. Where the Space Marines would eventually be designed as the mass-produced backbone of humanity's galactic armies, the Custodes were designed to be something far more intimate. They were not soldiers. They were sentinels. And they were never, ever meant to be deployed in the kind of numbers that could conquer a galaxy. The earliest records of the Custodes are fragmentary and deliberately obscured. Various accounts from the Unification Wars describe the Emperor being flanked by giants in crimson and gold during the earliest campaigns, demanding the surrender of warlords and tyrants, while these golden figures stood silently at his back, their very presence a promise of what would happen if the demand was refused. Some scholars believe that the first Custodians were created even before the Unification Wars began, that they were the Emperor's companions during a period of his existence that is simply too ancient and too deeply buried in secrecy for anyone to access. What we do know is that the Custodes were created using a fundamentally different process than the one that would later produce the Space Marines. There are no gene seed organs, no progenoid glands, no black carapace or Becher's gland or any of the other specialized implants that define the Astartes augmentation process. Instead, the creation of a custodian relies on something far older and far more sophisticated, a process known as bioalchemy, and it all begins with a child. The selection of a custodian candidate is, in many ways, the most mysterious part of the entire process. The lore tells us that the first custodes recruits were drawn from the children of Terran nobility. This practice has continued across the millennia, and to this day, all new initiates are drawn from infants among the noble houses of Terra. It is considered one of the greatest honors that a noble family can receive, to have their child chosen for transformation into a custodian. Not because the family will ever see that child again, you understand. The infant who is taken by the custodes ceases to exist as a member of that family the moment the selection is made. They belong to the Emperor now. They will never return home. They will never speak their birth name again. They will never know the touch of a parent, or the laughter of a sibling, or any of the thousand small comforts that make a childhood a childhood. But the honor is real, or at least it is perceived as real by those who give their children up to it, because the alternative is unthinkable. The alternative is to have your family overlooked entirely, to be deemed unworthy of contributing to the Emperor's personal guard, to be just another noble house on a world full of noble houses, distinguished by nothing and contributing nothing to the defense of the master of mankind. The infants are presented before a location known as the Avenue of Sacrifice, outside the Ascensor's gate of the Imperial Palace. Picture this, if you can, a processional route lined with statues of heroes whose names are carved in letters of gold that catch the flickering light of torches that have been burning continuously for 10,000 years. The air is thick with incense and the low chanting of priests whose entire lives are dedicated to maintaining the sanctity of this one stretch of stone. Noble families, dressed in their finest robes, their faces a mixture of pride and barely concealed grief, present their infants to the custodians who stand in silent judgment at the gate. And here is where the mystery deepens, because no one outside the custodes truly knows what criteria they use to select candidates. The law is deliberately vague on this point, noting only that the requirements are extraordinarily strict, both biological and psychological, and that only a tiny fraction of the infants presented are deemed suitable even for the very first step of the process. We are talking about numbers so small that it staggers the imagination, and one in many thousands might prove suitable for the simplest of the initial steps. And even from this already infinitesimal pool of candidates, survival through the subsequent decades of transformation is far from guaranteed. Think about what that means. You take a population of infants drawn from Terra's most genetically pristine noble bloodlines that have been carefully maintained and cultivated for millennia specifically because of their proximity to the Imperial Palace and the genetic legacy of old Earth's finest families. You apply selection criteria so exacting that only 1 in thousands passes the initial screening. And then, from that tiny handful of candidates, you begin a process of transformation that will take decades, during which many of those candidates will die or be deemed unsuitable and removed from the program. The result, after all of that filtering, all of that investment, all of that suffering and loss, is a single custodian. One warrior, one golden figure standing among the 10,000, each of whom was purchased at a price that would bankrupt worlds. Now you might be wondering about the mechanics of the selection itself. What exactly are the custodes looking for when they examine these infants? The honest answer is that the law does not give us specifics, and that is by design. The creation of a custodian is meant to be shrouded in secrecy, wrapped in layers of mysticism and deliberate obfuscation that prevent even the most powerful organizations in the Imperium from understanding or replicating the process. The Mechanicus, yes, with all their vast knowledge of technology and biological engineering, are not permitted anywhere near the process. The Custodes do not trust Mars with their secrets. They do not trust anyone with their secrets. The creation of new custodians is handled by a cadre of specialists known as generites, who are descended from the original scientists that aided the Emperor with the Primarch project long before the Imperium ever made contact with Mars. These Genurites are an extraordinary anomaly within the broader structure of the Imperium. They are not part of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They are not beholden to any external organization or authority. They are bound solely to the Custodies, their loyalty guaranteed by millennia of tradition and the kind of absolute, unwavering dedication that comes from knowing that the work you do is quite literally the most important work being done anywhere in the galaxy. These few families have retained secrets from before there was even an Imperium, secrets that the Emperor himself entrusted to them during the earliest days of his rise to power on Terra. Secrets that, if they were ever to fall into the wrong hands, could potentially be used to create warriors of comparable power to the Custodies themselves, which is precisely why the Custodies guard those secrets with such paranoid intensity. The Genurites work in hidden laboratories deep within the Imperial Palace, in chambers that are sealed behind wards and barriers that would stop a Titan in its tracks. They use equipment that was ancient before the Imperium was born, machines and technologies that date back to the Dark Age of technology and perhaps even further, maintained and operated according to protocols that are passed down through the Genurite families with the solemnity of sacred ritual. Because in a very real sense, that is exactly what it is, sacred ritual. The creation of a custodian is not merely a scientific procedure, it is an act of devotion, a continuation of the Emperor's own work, carried out in his name and according to his design by those he trusted above all others. When a candidate is selected, they vanish from the world. There is no ceremony of parting, no final embrace between parent and child. The infant is taken, and the family is left with nothing but the knowledge that their bloodline has contributed to the Emperor's guard. Though what happens next is something that no outsider has ever witnessed and lived to describe. But the lore gives us fragments, pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, paint a picture of a transformation so profound, so complete, and so fundamentally different from anything else in the Imperium that it barely qualifies as the same category of genetic enhancement used on Space Marines. Where the creation of a Space Marine involves the surgical implantation of additional organs, gene seed derived from a Primarch's genetic template, the creation of a Custodian involves something far more intimate and far more radical, bioalchemy. The word itself suggests something that exists at the intersection of science and something older, something that the rational mind of the Imperium's scientific establishment might call magic if they were not terrified of the word. It is not the crude insertion of foreign organs into a body that is already developed. It is the fundamental rewriting of the subject's biology at the cellular level. Every cell, every strand of genetic material, every protein, every enzyme, every molecular structure that makes up the infant's body is examined, catalogued, and then methodically transformed according to a template that is unique to that specific individual. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. There is no standardized set of organs that gets implanted in the same way every time. Each custodian is, quite literally, a unique work of art, a one-of-a-kind creation that will never be repeated. But because the specific combination of genetic factors that made that particular candidate suitable for transformation will never occur again in exactly the same way. The lore describes this process as taking root in the subject's cells and very soul. That last word is important. Soul. In the grim darkness of the far future, the soul is not a metaphor. It is a real, measurable thing, a presence in the warp that defines who and what a person is at the most fundamental level. And the bioalchemy that creates a custodian does not merely alter the body, it touches something deeper, something that the tech priests and geneticists of the Imperium cannot fully explain, but that the Custodies themselves understand with the quiet certainty of those who have experienced it firsthand. The transformation takes decades, not years, as with a Space Marine, decades. multiple solar decades of alchemical augmentation and psychomimetic training, during which the infant grows into a child, the child grows into a youth, and the youth grows into something that is no longer recognizable as the human being it once was. Throughout this entire process, the subject is being continuously modified, continuously refined, continuously shaped by forces that work at a level of precision that makes the most advanced gene therapy of the dark age of technology look like a child drawing with crayons. And the mortality rate is staggering. We do not have exact numbers, because the custodians do not share exact numbers. But the implications of the law are clear. The majority of candidates who enter the process do not survive it. Their bodies reject the changes. Their minds cannot withstand the psychomimetic conditioning. Their genetic material proves to be incompatible with some aspect of the transformation that could not have been detected during the initial screening. They die in laboratories buried beneath the imperial palace, their names unrecorded, and their sacrifice unknown to anyone outside the walls of the Custodes sanctum. Those who survive emerge as something that exists in the space between human and divine. They are taller than space marines, stronger, faster, more resilient. Their senses are sharpened to a degree that borders on the supernatural. Their minds are capable of processing information with a speed and clarity that allows them to anticipate enemy actions before they happen, to read the flow of a battle the way a master musician reads a symphony score. Keep picking out individual instruments from a wall of sound and knowing exactly when each one will play its next note. Their reflexes are so finely tuned that the difference between a custodian at the peak of their abilities and one who has begun to slow down is measured in tenths of a second, a deterioration so subtle that it would be imperceptible to anyone but another custodian. And they do not age, not in any meaningful biological sense. A custodian who is not killed in battle will live indefinitely, their body maintaining its peak condition through the centuries and millennia, with a persistence that defies the entropy that claims all other living things. Veteran custodians are measured not in decades or centuries of service, but in millennia. The oldest among them have walked the halls of the imperial palace for longer than many of the Imperium's worlds have been colonized. This is what waits at the end of the process. This is the reward for surviving decades of agony, for enduring transformations that would kill any ordinary human 100 times over. But the physical transformation is only half of the story, because a custodian is not merely a weapon that happens to be shaped like a person. A custodian is a complete being, a consciousness that has been cultivated with the same care and precision that was used to sculpt their body. And that is where the forging of the mind begins. The psychomimetic training that accompanies the physical transformation is perhaps even more remarkable than the bioalchemy itself, though it receives far less attention in the popular understanding of the Custodes. People tend to focus on the physical aspects, on the raw power and the golden armor and the massive weapons, because those are the things that are immediately visible and immediately impressive. But the true strength of a custodian lies not in their muscles or their reflexes, but in their mind. The training of a custodian encompasses fields of knowledge that would be considered unusual, even unnecessary, for a warrior. They are trained in the arts, not just the art of war, which they master to a degree that makes Space Marines look like enthusiastic amateurs, but the actual arts: painting, sculpture, music, literature, philosophy, history, geography, diplomacy, linguistics, the finer points of imperial law and governance, or the intricacies of political maneuvering among Terra's noble houses. The theological debates that have shaped the Imperium's relationship with faith and reason for 10,000 years. Why would a warrior need to understand philosophy? Why would a bodyguard need to appreciate the subtleties of a well-crafted symphony or the emotional weight of a masterfully painted portrait? Because the Custodes were never designed to be mere bodyguards. They were designed to be the Emperor's companions. Think about what that means. The Emperor of mankind is by any measure the most intelligent, most knowledgeable, and most perceptive being in human history. His mind contains the accumulated wisdom of thousands of lifetimes, his understanding of science, philosophy, art, and the full breadth of human experience is so vast that it makes the greatest scholars in the Imperium look like children playing with blocks. And for such a being to have companions, true companions, who could stand beside him and engage with him on something approaching an equal footing, those companions would need to be far more than simple soldiers. This is the fundamental difference between a custodian and a space marine. A space marine is a soldier, a magnificent, terrifying, overwhelmingly powerful soldier, but a soldier nonetheless. Their training is focused almost exclusively on the arts of war. Their conditioning strips away many of the softer aspects of human personality, replacing them with an iron-hard discipline and an absolute dedication to the military hierarchy of their chapter. They are weapons, all shaped and honed for the singular purpose of combat. A custodian is a person, a transhuman, genetically enhanced, effectively immortal person, yes, but a person nonetheless, with a fully developed personality, a broad intellectual curiosity, and a capacity for independent thought and judgment that would be considered dangerous in a space marine. The Custodians do not operate through blind obedience. They do not follow orders simply because orders have been given. Each custodian is trained to think, to analyze, to question, to evaluate the strategic and moral implications of every action they take. They are given free rein to attack or defend as they see fit, to pursue whatever strategy they judge most effective, to exercise their own judgment in the heat of battle without waiting for orders from above. Yes, this individualism is both their greatest strength and their most notable characteristic. Unlike space marines, who are trained from the ground up to function as part of a larger unit, to subsume their individual identities into the collective identity of their squad and their chapter, custodians prepare and inspect their equipment individually. They fight as individuals. They make their own tactical decisions. They share a genetic kinship with one another, certainly, but they do not foster the same spirit of brotherhood that defines the Astartes. And this is by design, because the bond that a custodian shares is not with their fellow custodians, it is with the Emperor himself. They were created to exist in his company, to serve as his eyes and ears and hands in the world. And their loyalty to him is absolute, in a way that transcends mere programming or conditioning. It is woven into the very fabric of their being, into those cells that were rewritten during their transformation, into that spark of the Emperor's own essence that burns within them like a candle that will never go out. Some scholars have speculated that the Emperor's own genetic matrix was used in the creation of the Custodians, that his own blood and flesh contributed to the bioalchemy that transforms an infant into a golden demigod. Others argue that the template came from some other source, something that was lost during the Age of Strife and can never be recovered. More recent accounts seem to confirm the former, suggesting that the Custodians carry within them a spark of the Emperor's own divinity, a presence that manifests as an almost supernatural warding that protects them from harm in ways that cannot be explained by simple physics. Bullets turn aside at the last moment. Blades fail to strike home. Psychic attacks flicker and die in the presence of a custodian, as if the very power of the warp recoils from the Emperor's light that burns within them. Some custodians find that this light becomes visible, manifesting as a golden halo that blinds their enemies and fills their allies with renewed strength and conviction. This is not the product of technology. This is not the result of clever engineering or advanced materials science. This is something else entirely, something that the Imperium's rational, technology-focused worldview cannot fully explain. There's something that suggests that the creation of a custodian is not merely a scientific process, but a spiritual one, a transformation that touches the soul as surely as it transforms the body. And it all begins with an infant, taken from its family, brought to the hidden laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace, and subjected to a process of transformation that will take decades to complete, and that most candidates will not survive. That is the cost of becoming a custodian. That is the price of standing in the Emperor's shadow. And for those who survive, for those who emerge from the crucible of transformation as something more than human, the reward is a life of eternal service, eternal vigilance, and the profound, unshakable knowledge that they are exactly what they were created to be. Let us go deeper into that transformation. Let us look at the bioalchemy itself, at the science and the mystery that turns a helpless infant into one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The bioalchemy that creates a custodian is, at its core, a process of cellular transformation. Unlike the space marine augmentation, which works by adding new components to an existing biological framework, implanting additional organs that grant specific capabilities, the custodian process works by fundamentally altering what is already there. It does not add to the body, it changes the body. Every cell, every molecule, every strand of DNA is examined, analyzed, and then rewritten according to a template that is unique to the individual candidate. The law tells us that this process triggers the subject's own transformation. That phrasing is crucial. The bioalchemy does not impose change from outside, the way a surgeon implants an organ. It unlocks change from within, activating dormant genetic potential that exists in every human being, but that evolution never had reason to express. It is as if every human carries within them the blueprint for something greater, a set of instructions that, if properly activated and guided, can transform an ordinary human body into something that exists on an entirely different plane of biological capability. The Genurites who oversee this process are working with tools and knowledge that predate the Imperium. These are not the tech priests of Mars, whose understanding of technology is filtered through millennia of dogma and superstition and half-understood rituals. These are the descendants of the Emperor's original scientific cadre. As individuals whose families have been preserving and refining these techniques since before the Unification Wars. They understand what they are doing at a level that no outsider can match, and they guard their knowledge with a ferocity that makes the Mechanicus's famous secrecy look positively transparent by comparison. The process begins almost immediately after the candidate is selected. The infant is taken to the transformation chambers, sealed environments deep within the palace, where the air itself is saturated with carefully calibrated chemical compounds designed to begin the preliminary conditioning of the subject's biology. The child breathes in these compounds, absorbs them through their skin, and the first subtle changes begin to take place at a level far too small for the naked eye to detect. Over the following weeks and months, the Genurites begin the active phase of the transformation. Using technologies that combine elements of genetic engineering, nanotechnology, chemical manipulation, and techniques that have no modern equivalent or name, they begin to systematically alter the candidate's cellular structure. Each cell is individually targeted, its genetic code rewritten to express new proteins, new enzymes, new biological structures that will eventually coalesce into the enhanced physiology of a fully transformed custodian. This is not a process that can be rushed. The law is emphatic on this point. The creation of a custodian takes multiple solar decades, and any attempt to accelerate the process would result in catastrophic failure and the death of the candidate. The changes must be introduced gradually, layer upon layer, each new modification building upon the foundation laid by the previous one. The body must be given time to integrate each change, to adapt its existing systems, to accommodate the new capabilities being expressed by its altered cells.
Honestly, I just want to take a second here to say something that I think about a lot when I'm researching this stuff. The Custodes are hands down my favorite faction in all of 40k, and I know that's a hot take for some people because they're not as flashy as Space Marines, they don't have the meme energy of the orcs, and they don't nearly get enough time on the tabletop or in the novels, but that's kind of what draws me to them. There's something about a warrior who doesn't care if you know their name, who doesn't need a saga written about them, who just does the job because the job needs doing. That hits different for me. In a setting where everyone is screaming about glory and honor and eternal war, the Custodes are just quietly standing there being the best at what they do and not asking for applause. And I think that's cooler than any Bolter montage. But anyways, that was just my take. Let's go back to the video.
Imagine it like the construction of an impossibly complex building. You cannot start by placing the roof. You must begin with the foundation, laying each stone with precise care, ensuring that every element is perfectly aligned and perfectly stable before adding the next. And you must continue this process, stone by stone, layer by layer, for decades, never making a mistake, never placing a single element out of sequence, because a single error at any point in the process could bring the entire structure crashing down. That is what the Generites do, for decades, for each individual candidate. As the physical transformation progresses, the candidate's body begins to change in ways that would be visible to an outside observer. They grow larger, of course. A fully transformed Custodian stands head and shoulders taller than a Space Marine, who is already over 7 feet tall. Their musculature develops along lines that seem almost sculpted, each muscle group defined with a precision that suggests intentional design rather than natural growth. Their bone structure thickens and strengthens, becoming denser and more resilient than ceramite. Their organs, which in a Space Marine would be supplemented by additional implanted organs, are instead transformed in place, their existing heart, lungs, kidneys, and other organs being enhanced and modified to perform at levels that far exceed what nature intended. The sensory enhancements are particularly striking. A Custodian's eyesight is sharp enough to pick out individual faces in a crowd at distances that would require a normal human to use magnification. Their hearing can distinguish between the footsteps of different individuals by the subtle differences in weight distribution and gait. Their sense of smell is acute enough to detect chemical compounds in concentrations measured in parts per billion, and these are just the passive enhancements. When actively engaged, when their enhanced nervous system is operating at full capacity and their brain is processing sensory input at speeds that make a cogitator look sluggish, a Custodian can perceive the world with a clarity and precision that borders on precognition. They can reach into what the lore describes as the numerology of the near future, are reading the patterns of movement and intention in their environment with such accuracy that they can anticipate attacks before they are launched, predict the trajectory of projectiles before they are fired, and position themselves in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to intercept threats that have not yet materialized. This is not psychic ability. The Custodes are not psychers, and their enhancement does not grant them access to the warp in the way that a librarian or a battle psyker might. It is something else. A kind of hyper-awareness, a biological computer running predictive algorithms on sensory data, so vast and so detailed that the results feel like prophecy to those who witness them. But the physical changes, as impressive as they are only the most visible aspect of the transformation. Beneath the surface, yet at a level that no external observer can perceive, something even more profound is taking place. The bioalchemy is not merely changing the candidate's body, it is changing their soul. The warp, that hellish dimension of psychic energy that underlies all of physical reality in the 40k universe, interacts with living beings through their souls. Every living creature has a presence in the warp, a reflection of their consciousness that can be perceived by psychers, and that serves as the mechanism through which the powers of chaos exert their influence. Normal humans have small, dim presences in the warp. Psychers burn brighter. Space Marines, with their enhanced physiology and conditioned minds, have a somewhat different quality to their warp presence. Custodians are something else entirely, as the bioalchemy that transforms their cells also transforms their warp presence, touching it with a spark of the Emperor's own psychic power. This manifests as the Aegis of the Emperor, a protective aura that radiates from every custodian and that provides an almost supernatural level of protection against psychic attack and warp-based corruption. In the presence of a custodian, psychic powers falter and fail. Demonic entities recoil. The insidious whispers of chaos, which can penetrate the defenses of even the most strong-willed space marines, break like waves against a cliff face when they encounter the Emperor's light that burns within the Golden Warriors. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Custodian transformation. It does not merely make the subject physically superior, then it makes them spiritually resistant to corruption in a way that no other augmentation process can replicate. Space Marines, for all their conditioning and all their genetic modification, can fall to chaos. The Horus heresy proved that beyond any shadow of doubt. Primarchs, beings of godlike power created by the Emperor's own hand, succumbed to the lure of the dark gods, but no custodian has ever fallen. Not one. In over 10,000 years of existence, through the Horus heresy and the war within the Webway and the countless battles that have followed, not a single custodian has ever been corrupted by chaos. That is not an accident. That is the result of a transformation that goes deeper than flesh and bone, that touches the very essence of what a person is and remakes it in the Emperor's image. The cellular alchemy that creates a custodian leaves them forever touched by a spark of the Emperor's own divinity. Beyond their martial might and incorruptible nobility, this energy manifests as an almost supernatural warding. They are, in a very real sense, walking pieces of the Emperor's will, extensions of his power and his purpose in the material world. And all of this staggering capability, all of this spiritual resilience, all of this physical perfection, begins with an infant who is taken from their family and subjected to a process of transformation that they cannot consent to and cannot understand. There is a bleakness to that, if you think about it long enough. A darkness at the heart of something golden. Yet the child who enters the transformation chambers beneath the Imperial Palace will never know who they were before the process began. They will never remember the face of their mother or the sound of their father's voice. They will never know what it felt like to be an ordinary human child, to play in the sunlight or cry when they were hungry, or laugh at something that struck their developing brain as funny. All of that is erased, overwritten by the bioalchemy that transforms them into something greater. Or is it something lesser? That depends on your perspective. From the perspective of the Imperium, the transformation is an honor beyond measure, the elevation of a human being to a state of near divinity in service to the master of mankind. From the perspective of the child, if they could have one, it is the destruction of everything they might have been in exchange for something they never asked to become. But the 41st millennium is not a time for philosophical hand-wringing about consent and individual autonomy. It is a time of war, of survival, of desperate measures taken by desperate people to stave off the extinction of their entire species. And the Custodies, whatever the moral complexities of their creation might be, are one of the few things standing between humanity and the abyss. So let us move past the moral questions and focus on what these golden warriors become once the transformation is complete. Let us talk about the weapons they carry, the armor they wear, and the traditions that define their existence. Because a custodian is not complete when the bioalchemy ends. That is merely the beginning. And the foundation has been laid, the raw material has been shaped. But a custodian is more than a genetically enhanced body and a sharpened mind. A custodian is a warrior who carries the weight of 10,000 years of tradition on their shoulders, who wields weapons that were ancient when the Imperium was young, and who wears armor that is, quite literally, worth a planet's ransom. The armor of the Adeptus Custodes is not made from ceramite. Ceramite is the material used in Space Marine power armor, a heat and shock resistant ceramic composite that is tough, reliable, and relatively easy to produce in the quantities needed to equip 1 million warriors across 1,000 chapters. It is a good material, an excellent material by the standards of the 41st millennium, but it is not good enough for the Emperor's personal guard. Our Custodian armor is crafted from auramite. The name itself tells you something. Aura, gold. This is a material of unknown provenance, a substance that no one outside the Custodes' armorsmiths fully understands. Its natural coloration is a shining, lustrous gold, a hue that gives the Custodes their distinctive and instantly recognizable appearance on the battlefield. It is similar in some ways to ceramite, sharing some of the same heat and shock-resistant properties, but it surpasses ceramite in almost every measurable category of performance. It is harder, more resilient, better at dispersing the energy of incoming attacks, and it possesses a unique property that makes it invaluable for warriors who exist in a universe saturated with psychic energy. Auramite is almost inert at a quantum level. This means that it does not interfere with the manipulation of psychic energy the way ceramite does. A psyker encased in ceramite power armor is somewhat inhibited by the material, their powers dampened by the physical barrier between their body and the warp. A Custodian's auramite armor has no such effect. The Emperor's own auramite battleplate was specifically chosen for this property. During the Siege of Terra, when the Emperor was fighting his immaterial battle against the powers of chaos, while seated upon the Golden Throne, his auramite armor protected his physical body from the immense psychic energies he was channeling, without interfering with his ability to project those energies into the warp. If he had worn ceramite instead, the energies would have burned his flesh to the bone. Each suit of Custodian armor is unique. There is no standard template, no assembly line. Each suit is custom-made and fitted to its wearer by armorsmiths, who are themselves part of the Custodes' closed ecosystem of specialized artisans and craftspeople. These armorsmiths, like the Genurites, are separate from the Mechanicus. They answer to no one outside the Custodes. Their techniques and their materials are their own, guarded with the same paranoid secrecy that characterizes everything about the Emperor's Guard. The suit is crafted to the exact physical specifications of its wearer. Every curve, every joint, every articulation point is designed to work in perfect harmony with the Custodian's enhanced physiology, allowing them to move with a speed and fluidity that seems impossible for a being encased in what appears to be full-plate armor. Yet the surfaces are covered with intricate decorative elements, icons and symbols and heraldic devices that tell the story of the Custodian's service. And the name of the Custodian who wears the armor is inscribed within its interior, a private mark of identity that no one else will ever see. Through closely guarded alchemical processes, the gold of auramite can be tinted or its color changed altogether at a molecular level. This is not painting. This is not the application of a surface coating that could chip or wear away. It is a fundamental alteration of the material's appearance at the atomic level, a process that is painstaking and costly, but that the Custodes consider far more appropriate to their status than the crude method of simply applying paint over the surface of their armor. The armor is also equipped with arrays of proximity sensors and refraction field generators that further enhance its already formidable defensive capabilities. Refraction fields are energy shields that deflect incoming projectiles and energy weapons, adding another layer of protection on top of the auramite's natural resilience. When a Custodian takes the field, they are encased in a shell of golden metal and shimmering energy that is all but impervious to the weapons that would tear through a Space Marine's ceramite armor like wet paper. And then there are the weapons. The signature weapon of the Adeptus Custodes is the Guardian Spear. You have almost certainly seen images of these weapons if you have any familiarity with the 40k setting. They are enormous. A halberd-like polearms that combine a power blade at one end with an integrated bolter weapon built into the haft. A Guardian Spear is so heavy that it would take several ordinary men working together just to lift it off the ground. In the hands of a Custodian, it is wielded with a speed and precision that makes it look weightless, spinning in great arcs, that create a blur of golden metal and crackling energy as the power field surrounding the blade cuts through armor, flesh, and bone with equal ease. The bolter built into the Guardian spear is not a standard bolter. It fires specialized ammunition, handcrafted by the Custodian's own artisans, each round a miniature work of lethal engineering that is restricted to their use alone. Even the ammunition of the Custodians is considered too precious and too dangerous to share with anyone else. But the Guardian spear is only the most common weapon in the Custodian arsenal. There are other weapons, older weapons, more dangerous weapons that the Custodians have access to by virtue of their position as the keepers of the Imperial Palace's vast museum arsenals. Adrathic weapons, relics from the Age of Strife that disintegrate their targets at a molecular level, are shared with no other organization in the Imperium. The Mechanicus has coveted these weapons for millennia and has been denied access to them with a firmness that borders on contempt. Sentinel blades, Castellan axes, pyrethite spears that mount compact melter weapons capable of melting through the thickest armor in seconds. The Custodian's armory is a treasure trove of destruction that represents the absolute pinnacle of human weapons technology. And beyond the personal weapons, there are the vehicles. The Custodians do not use the same vehicles as the rest of the Imperium's military forces. They have their own designs, many of which utilize anti-gravity technology that is exceedingly rare elsewhere in the Imperium. Grav tanks like the Caladius and the Pallas, Dawn Eagle jet bikes that allow Virtus Praetors to sweep across the battlefield at tremendous speed, Coronus grav carriers that serve as armored transports. Every vehicle in the Custodian's fleet is a masterwork of engineering, maintained and operated according to traditions that have been preserved for 10,000 years. This is what a Custodian carries into battle: armor worth the ransom of worlds. Weapons that represent the absolute peak of human destructive capability. Vehicles that combine ancient technologies with design principles that the rest of the Imperium has long since forgotten how to replicate. And behind all of it, driving all of it, animating all of it with purpose and power, is the consciousness of a being who has spent decades being transformed into the ultimate expression of human martial potential. But before we move to the training and the traditions that define Custodian existence, we need to understand the broader context of their history. Because the Custodes did not emerge fully formed from the Emperor's laboratories one day and immediately take up their positions around the Golden Throne. Their story is woven into the very fabric of the Imperium's founding, and to understand what a Custodian is, you need to understand the fires in which the first Custodians were forged. The earliest confirmed appearance of beings we would recognize as Custodians dates to the very beginning of the Unification Wars, perhaps even before. When the Emperor first revealed himself to the warring factions of Old Earth, when he emerged from whatever hidden sanctuary had sheltered him during the long millennia of the Age of Strife, he was not alone. Ancient artwork from the period depicts him flanked by figures in crimson and gold, enormous warriors whose armor gleamed like molten metal in the firelight of burning cities. These were the first Custodians, not 10,000 of them, not even 100, a handful, perhaps fewer, but they were there, standing at the Emperor's side before any other genetically enhanced warrior in human history had drawn breath. Yet the fall of the techno-barbarian fortress at Narsisau is generally considered the first major engagement where the Custodes can be confirmed to have participated. In the artwork and records from this battle, the being who would become the Emperor is shown flanked by 4 figures in gold and red war gear. Their presence, a silent declaration of his power and his intentions. These 4 warriors, whoever they were, represent the beginning of a tradition that would stretch across 10,000 years and counting. As the Unification Wars progressed, the ranks of the Custodes grew, though they never approached anything like the numbers of the Thunder Warriors. Where the Thunder Legions eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, the Custodes grew more slowly, each new addition representing the successful completion of a transformation process that took decades and claimed the lives of countless failed candidates. By the time the Unification Wars were reaching their bloody conclusion, the Custodians numbered in the hundreds. A tiny force by the standards of the conflicts being waged across Terra, but one whose individual warriors were more powerful than anything else on the battlefield, the Emperor himself excepted. It was during this period that the being who would become the most famous custodian in history first emerged into prominence. Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the shield of the Emperor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes. We do not know much about Valdor's origins. What we do know is that the Emperor spent considerable time and effort searching for him, which suggests that Valdor was somehow special even before his transformation. Perhaps his genetic profile was uniquely suited to the Custodian transformation. Perhaps there was something about his personality or his psychic potential that marked him as exceptional. Whatever the reason, the Emperor identified Valdor as something extraordinary and ensured that the full weight of the Custodian creation process was brought to bear on transforming him into the ultimate warrior. And the results spoke for themselves. Even among the Custodes, who were already the most formidable individual warriors in the Emperor's service, Valdor stood apart. His martial prowess was so extraordinary that there were those within the imperial court who whispered that he was a Primarch in all but name, saying, and a comparison that was not taken lightly, given that the Primarchs were semi-divine beings created from the Emperor's own genetic template for the specific purpose of being the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Valdor could stand eye to eye with the Primarchs. He could match them in single combat, or come so close to matching them that the difference was academic. Records suggest that he once fought Alpharius, the Primarch of the Alpha Legion, to a stalemate, neither combatant recognizing the other's identity during their encounter. The performance further cemented Valdor's reputation as something beyond even the standard of Custodian excellence. But Valdor was more than a fighter. He was a strategist, a diplomat, a counselor, and a confidant. He sat on the Emperor's Council of War alongside Malcador, the Sigillite, and Rogel Dawn during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. He oversaw the deployment of the Custodian forces during the war within the Webway, the devastating conflict that raged beneath the Imperial Palace when Magnus the Red's catastrophic attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal tore a hole in the carefully constructed barriers between real space and the warp. He was present at the meetings of the Officio Assassinorum's clade leaders, and it was Valdor who suggested the revolutionary approach of sending assassins from multiple clades on a single mission to eliminate Horus, rather than relying on the traditional method of sending a single operative. The Emperor gave Valdor a weapon to match his station, the Apollonian Spear, as a guardian spear of unparalleled power that was believed to have been crafted by the Emperor's own hand. This weapon had a unique property beyond its devastating combat capabilities. When Valdor struck down an enemy with the Apollonian Spear, it granted him glimpses of the truth of the being he had just slain. The Emperor intended this as a check on Valdor's power, a way of ensuring that the Captain General would never become callous or detached in his killing. Every death dealt by the Apollonian Spear carried with it a moment of understanding, a flash of insight into the life and motivations of the person who had just been ended. This detail reveals something fascinating about the Emperor's relationship with his custodes. He did not want them to be unfeeling weapons, or yet he did not want them to kill without consequence or without awareness of what killing meant. The Apollonian Spear was a tool of deliberate empathy, forcing the greatest warrior in the Emperor's service to confront the reality of every life he took. It is a far cry from the approach taken with the Space Marines, whose emotional range was deliberately constrained by their conditioning to make them more effective soldiers. The Emperor wanted his custodes to be better than that, to be complete beings, capable of understanding the full weight of their actions and choosing to act regardless. Valdor's career spanned the entirety of the Imperium's golden age and its catastrophic fall. He fought at the Emperor's side during the final campaigns of the Unification Wars. He was present during the Great Crusade, though he rarely ventured far from the Emperor's person except on special missions of the highest importance. He oversaw the brutal necessity of the Thunder Warriors culling at Mount Ararat, an act that he took no pleasure in, but carried out with the unflinching efficiency that defined his character. He watched as the Primarchs were found and reunited with the Emperor, and he never fully trusted them. Valdor had warned Malcador that the scattered Primarchs might have been corrupted during their time away from the Emperor's protection, and he had advocated for abandoning the search and instead building the Imperium's military around Custodian-led armies of unaugmented humans. This advice was not taken. The consequences of that decision would shake the galaxy to its foundations. When the Horus heresy erupted, Valdor was on Terra, overseeing the Custodian forces that guarded the Imperial Palace. The war within the Webway consumed much of his attention during the early years of the heresy, as the breach caused by Magnus's disastrous psychic communication had allowed demons to pour into the tunnels beneath the palace in numbers that threatened to overwhelm even the Custodes' defenses. The Custodians fought in those lightless tunnels for years, battling entities that defied description and that attacked not just the body, but the soul. The war cost them dearly. By the time the breach was finally sealed, the Custodes had been reduced from their full strength of 10,000 to approximately 1,000 warriors. 5 years of continuous, unrelenting combat against the very worst things the warp could throw at them had consumed 9/10 of the Emperor's Golden Guard. Think about what that means. These were the 10,000. The most powerful individual warriors the Imperium had ever produced, each one a decades-long investment of irreplaceable resources and knowledge, each one worth more, in raw military capability, than an entire company of Space Marines. And 9,000 of them died in those tunnels, not on some distant battlefield at the edge of the galaxy, not in a glorious charge against impossible odds, with banners flying and hymns echoing off the walls of some alien fortress. They died in the dark, beneath their own home, fighting an enemy that should never have been there. As an enemy that was only present because one of the Emperor's own sons made a catastrophic mistake, born of desperation and love. There is something almost unbearably sad about that. The war within the Webway is one of the most tragic episodes in the lore of the Custodes, and it shaped the organization profoundly. The loss of 9,000 Custodians was not merely a military setback. It was a wound that cut to the very heart of what the Custodes were supposed to be. They were supposed to be invincible. They were supposed to be the Emperor's ultimate defense against any threat. And they had been decimated, not by a superior military force, but by the consequences of a single Primarch's folly. During the siege of Terra itself, Valdor led the surviving Custodes in a series of devastating counterattacks against the traitor legions that had made landfall on the throne world. The Death Guard, bloated with the unholy gifts of Nurgle, found that the Custodes were uniquely effective against them. The Emperor-forged nature of the Custodians made them anathema to anything touched by chaos, and the 14th Legion routinely lost dozens or hundreds of Astartes in engagements with Custodian forces. When the Emperor teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the Imperium, Valdor was summoned to his side. But during the teleportation, Valdor was separated from the Emperor and found himself trapped in a lightless abyss within the ship, surrounded by demons. It was a trap, designed by Horus to prevent the Captain General from reaching the Emperor and fulfilling his duty. For the first time in his existence, Valdor felt something approaching fear. Not fear for himself, but fear that he would fail the Emperor at the moment when the Emperor needed him most. He fought through the demons. He fought through the Chaos Space Marines who barred his path. Injured, weakened, outnumbered by over 30 to 1, he and his remaining Custodes battled with a ferocity that left even the traitor Astartes stunned. Valdor was wounded, impaled by a power sword, brought to the edge of what even a Custodian's enhanced physiology could endure. And still he fought, because that is what Custodians do. They fight until they cannot fight anymore, and then they fight some more. after the heresy. Valdor briefly served as a High Lord of Terror, but his heart was not in governance. And then, one night, without warning or explanation, he disappeared. He walked out of the Imperial Palace in the dead of night, turned back once to look upon the structure that had been his entire world, whispered the words, "Only in death," and vanished into the darkness. His fate remains one of the greatest mysteries in the Imperium. Some believe he still lives, carrying out some final mission that only the Emperor knows about. The legacy of Valdor shaped the Custodies for the 10 millennia that followed his disappearance. His example set the standard that every subsequent Custodian would be measured against. After Valdor, the mantle of Captain General passed to a succession of leaders, each of whom guided the Custodes through their long vigil on Terra. Following the heresy, the Custodes withdrew from galactic affairs almost entirely. The Edict of Restraint limited them to the defense of the Imperial Palace, and for nearly 10,000 years, the Golden Warriors rarely left Terra. During this long period of isolation, the Custodes maintained their strength at approximately 10,000 warriors. New Custodians continued to be created, replacing those who fell in battle or who chose to step down from active service. The process of creation remained unchanged. The same bioalchemy, the same Ginurites, the same hidden laboratories beneath the palace. The only difference was that the Emperor no longer personally oversaw each creation, a task that had become impossible after his internment on the Golden Throne. 300 of the most elite custodians, known as the Companions, and maintained a constant vigil around the Emperor's physical form on the Golden Throne. They stand in a ring, never sleeping, never resting, weapons drawn and senses extended to their maximum capacity at all times. The longest recorded period of unbroken service among the Companions is held by Astoran Kalos, who endured 100 years of constant vigilance before surrendering his place. 100 years, standing in the same spot, never sleeping, never sitting, never looking away. That is the level of dedication the Custodes consider normal. Beyond the Companions, the Custodes are organized into several distinct operational groups and castes. The Hikanatoi form the main strength of the Custodian Guard. These are the Guardian spear-equipped heavy infantry who serve as the core of any deployment. The Tharanatoi are the Terminators, all warriors in the heaviest armor equipped with the most destructive weapons. The Alaris Terminators are perhaps the most famous, elite shock troops deployed to shatter enemy command structures. The Cataphractoi are fast attack specialists riding Dawn Eagle jet bikes at tremendous speeds. The Sagittarum Guard are ranged specialists deploying devastating heavy weapons at extreme distances. The Ephoroi specialize in covert operations, intelligence gathering, and assassination. And the Moritoi are the Dreadnoughts, wounded custodians interred in war machines to continue their service beyond what their damaged bodies could otherwise sustain. The organizational structure extends upward from these castes to shield companies, the standard operational unit led by a shield captain and shield hosts, as larger formations deploying multiple shield companies for major threats. Above the shield captains stand the tribunes, senior officers who coordinate the activities of multiple shield hosts. And at the pinnacle sits the Captain General. The current Captain General is Trajan Valoris, the 17th to hold the position. Under his leadership, the Custodes underwent their most significant transformation since the Horus Heresy. Following the birth of the Great Rift and Guilliman's return, Valoris worked with the Lord Commander to formally amend the Custodes' role. The Custodes committed to greatly expanding their extrasolar activities. Aided by oracular doomscryers and alpha-level astropathic intercepts, more shield hosts than ever before now strike out from Terra to eliminate threats to the Emperor before those threats can reach the throne world. Sometimes, the best defense is an overwhelming offense. The Shadowkeepers represent another fascinating aspect of custodian operations. Led by the Lock Warden, they maintain the dark cells, prisons deep beneath the Imperial Palace where horrors from the Age of Strife are kept under perpetual guard. These are creatures and entities that cannot be killed, and must instead be contained and watched forever. The Warders of the Vaults of Rythan are an even more shadowy subforce, deployed in the deepest areas of the palace. What they guard is known only to themselves and the Captain General. All of these formations exist within a framework unique in the Imperium. The Custodians answer to the Emperor alone. This gives them authority that supersedes every other organization. When a Custodian speaks, they speak with the Emperor's authority. Space Marines kneel before them. Inquisitors defer to their judgment. Planetary governors step aside when a Golden Warrior issues orders. Now, let us talk about what takes a newly transformed Custodian and shapes them into the kind of warrior who can carry that authority. Let us talk about the training, and let us talk about the blood games. But the blood games are much more than a simple penetration test, and we have only scratched the surface of what they reveal about the Custodian character. Let us dig deeper. Consider the psychological implications of a blood game from the perspective of the Custodian undertaking it. For months, perhaps a full year, they must live as something they are not. They must suppress every instinct that their transformation has given them. They must move through crowds of ordinary humans, are breathing the same air, walking the same streets, occupying the same spaces, while hiding the fundamental truth of their nature behind layers of deception. For a being whose entire existence is predicated on honesty of purpose, on the transparent and uncompromising pursuit of a singular duty, this experience of sustained deception is profoundly disorienting, and yet it is necessary. Because the enemies of the Emperor do not announce themselves. They do not wear uniforms that identify them as threats. They move through the population of terror, disguised as merchants, pilgrims, servants, administrators, and 1,000 other unremarkable identities, hiding their true purposes behind facades of normalcy. To counter these threats, the Custodians must understand how they operate. They must be able to think like an infiltrator, and to see the world through the eyes of someone who is hiding in plain sight. And the only way to develop that understanding is to experience it firsthand. The blood games also serve as a pressure valve, though the Custodians would never describe them in such terms. The palace is, for all its vastness, a closed environment. The same corridors, the same chambers, the same faces, both human and transhuman, day after day, century after century. The blood games offer individual Custodians a chance to step outside that environment, to experience the wider world of terror in all its chaotic, teeming, overwhelming complexity. The sensory richness of a hive city, the unpredictability of human behavior in its natural habitat, the constant low-level threat of a world where billions of desperate people compete for limited resources, and all of these things provide a kind of stimulation that the controlled environment of the palace cannot match. This is not recreation. The Custodians do not take holidays, but the intellectual and psychological benefits of the blood games are real, and the Custodians are pragmatic enough to recognize their value, even if they would never frame it in terms of personal well-being. There is also a competitive element to the blood games, though it is understated in a way that is characteristic of Custodian culture. Each blood game is evaluated after its conclusion, the methods used by the infiltrating Custodian analyzed, and the lessons learned distributed to the rest of the organization. A Custodian who devises a particularly innovative approach to breaching the palace's defenses earns recognition from their peers, are not public acclaim or formal honors, but the quiet respect of warriors who understand exactly how difficult the exercise is and who can appreciate the artistry of a particularly elegant solution to a seemingly impossible problem. The story of Armon Taramakian's blood game, as described in Dan Abnett's short story, illustrates many of these principles in action. Armon spends a year living undercover on Terra, building a network of contacts and informants, developing the intelligence he needs to identify a vulnerability in the palace's defenses, and then exploiting that vulnerability with a precision and decisiveness that is characteristically Custodian. When he returns to the palace, he is immediately debriefed, the methods he used analyzed in detail, and the defensive gap he exploited sealed. But Amon is not given time to rest or reflect on his experience. He is immediately assigned to a new mission, a real intelligence operation targeting a suspected traitor in the hive of Brazil. The transition from training exercise to operational deployment is seamless, because for a custodian, there is no meaningful distinction between the two. Every blood game is conducted with the same seriousness and the same stakes as a real operation. And every real operation is approached with the same analytical rigor and the same willingness to improvise that characterizes a blood game. In the more extreme version of the blood games that was practiced during the long millennia between the heresy and the Indomitus Crusade, the stakes were raised even further. And a specialized corps of custodians was tasked with recovering suitable subjects from across the Imperium, including actual Chaos Space Marines, and releasing them within the Imperial Palace complex as part of a live-fire combat exercise. These were not simulations. These were real enemies fighting for their lives in unfamiliar territory, against opponents they could not hope to defeat. The Custodes used these exercises to test their defensive protocols against the most dangerous opponents the galaxy could produce, learning from each engagement and refining their tactics accordingly. Picture the scene. Deep within the Imperial Palace, in some section of the vast complex that has been sealed off and designated as an exercise area, a Chaos Space Marine is released from containment. He is armed. And because an unarmed enemy is not a useful test subject, he is dangerous, corrupted by the powers of the warp and driven by hatred of everything the Imperium represents. He knows he is going to die because no one survives the blood games, not the live fire version. But he also knows that every moment he survives, every inch of territory he claims, every defensive position he forces the Custodes to overcome, represents a data point that the Golden Warriors will use to improve their defenses. Even in death, even as a tool of his most hated enemies, the Chaos Space Marine serves a purpose. The Custodes who hunt him through the corridors of the palace are not playing games. They are conducting a military exercise with the same deadly seriousness that they bring to every aspect of their existence. They study the traitor's movements, are analyzing his tactics and comparing them against their existing threat models. They test different approaches to engagement, comparing the effectiveness of various weapons and tactics against a real opponent in real conditions. And when the exercise is over, when the Chaos Space Marine lies dead on the palace floor, the Custodes catalogue every lesson learned and incorporate it into their training and defensive protocols. This is the world of the blood games. A world where training and reality blur together until the distinction becomes meaningless. A world where perfection is pursued with a relentless intensity that would break any lesser warrior. A world where the price of failure is not a poor evaluation or a reprimand from a superior officer, but the potential death of the Emperor and the end of human civilization. Now, let us move beyond the blood games and consider the broader existence of a custodian who has completed their transformation, earned their name, taken their place among the 10,000, and begun the long, long watch that will define the rest of their effectively immortal life. The popular image of the Custodes, golden statues standing motionless around the golden throne in eternal vigil, is dramatic but incomplete. The reality of custodian life is far more varied and far more demanding than simple vigil, though the vigil is certainly a part of it. The Imperial Palace is enormous. It covers entire continents. Its corridors stretch for hundreds of miles. Its chambers range from intimate meditation cells, barely large enough for a single person, to cathedral halls whose vaulted ceilings disappear into darkness hundreds of meters overhead. Beneath the surface, the palace extends even further, descending into the crust of the planet through layer after layer of vaults, tunnels, laboratories, prisons, armories, and chambers whose purpose has been forgotten by everyone, perhaps even the Custodes themselves. Patrolling this structure is not a matter of walking a regular route and checking that the doors are locked. It is a full-time military operation involving thousands of warriors deployed across millions of square miles of fortified territory. The Custodes must maintain awareness of every approach to the Emperor's person, every potential vulnerability in the palace's defenses, every access point that could be exploited by an enemy, with sufficient knowledge and resources. They must monitor the activities of the countless organizations that operate within the palace. They must investigate any anomaly, any unexplained event, any deviation from established patterns that might indicate the presence of a threat. A single custodian on patrol is processing vast amounts of sensory data in real time. Their enhanced senses pick up conversations happening hundreds of meters away, filtering ambient noise to isolate specific voices or keywords. They detect chemical signatures of explosives, poisons, or alien biochemistry at concentrations that would be invisible to any ordinary sensor. They feel subtle vibrations in the floor that indicate the movement of vehicles or personnel in nearby corridors. They are, in effect, a walking sensor array of extraordinary sophistication, and they process everything they detect through an intellect that has been honed by decades of training and centuries of experience. Beyond patrol, custodians engage in a perpetual cycle of training, education, and self-improvement that would exhaust any lesser warrior within weeks. Their training regimen is not a fixed program with a beginning and an end. It is an ongoing process of refinement that continues for the entire duration of the custodian's service, which can span centuries or even millennia. A custodian who has served for 1,000 years is still training, still improving, still seeking to refine their capabilities to an ever finer edge of perfection. The assumption that underlies all custodian training is that perfection is asymptotic, a state that can be approached infinitely closely, but never quite achieved, and that the pursuit of that impossible perfection is itself the point of the exercise. Their combat drills are conducted with live weapons against other custodians, the only opponents who can provide a meaningful challenge. They study constantly, maintaining and expanding their expertise across dozens of disciplines. They debate philosophy, analyze intelligence reports, develop contingency plans, and maintain their equipment with an obsessive attention to detail that reflects the same perfectionism that defines every other aspect of their existence. They maintain their own equipment personally. Unlike space marines, who rely on chapter serfs and tech marines to service their war gear, custodians are responsible for the care and maintenance of their own weapons and armor. Each custodian knows every component of their war gear as intimately as they know their own body. So they can disassemble and reassemble their guardian spear in complete darkness by touch alone. This personal relationship with their equipment is not merely practical, it is philosophical. The armor and weapons of a custodian are extensions of their identity, physical manifestations of the duty they have sworn to uphold. To entrust their maintenance to someone else would be to delegate a part of that duty, which is something a custodian simply does not do. And through it all, beneath the training and the patrols and the intellectual pursuits and the equipment maintenance, there runs a current of something that defies easy description. Call it purpose. Call it dedication. Call it the quiet, unshakable certainty that what you are doing matters more than anything else anyone is doing anywhere in the galaxy. Because for a custodian, it does. But the Emperor must be protected. The palace must be secured. The duty must be fulfilled. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is noise. Now let us turn to a subject that is perhaps the most poignant aspect of custodian existence. Let us talk about what happens when the golden vigil begins to fade, when the body that has served without faltering for centuries or millennia begins, at last, to show the faintest signs of diminishment. The custodes are functionally immortal. They do not age in any meaningful biological sense. Their bodies maintain peak condition through the centuries and millennia, with a persistence that defies the entropy that claims all other living things. Disease cannot touch them. The slow cellular deterioration that kills ordinary humans passes them by without leaving a mark. But they are not truly immortal. Are not in the absolute sense, because even the most perfect biological system, even one that has been enhanced by the Emperor's own bioalchemy and sustained by a spark of his divine power, is subject to the accumulated wear of existence. Over enough time, and we are talking about timescales measured in millennia, the custodian body begins to slow. Not by much, not by any amount that would be perceptible to anyone but another custodian. A tenth of a second added to reaction time, a fraction of a degree less precision in the arc of a blade, a marginally slower processing speed when analyzing complex tactical data. To you or me, these changes would be invisible. To a space marine, they would be undetectable. But to a custodian, trained to operate at the absolute peak of transhuman capability, as conditioned to accept nothing less than perfection in every aspect of their performance, these infinitesimal degradations are devastating. They represent the beginning of the end. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow, inexorable decline that will, given enough time, reduce the custodian's capabilities to a level that they consider unacceptable for the duty they have sworn to perform. When a custodian recognizes these signs in themselves, and it is always a self-recognition because no one else can detect them, they face a choice that is perhaps the most personal and most difficult of their entire existence. They must decide whether to continue serving in a diminished capacity or to step down from active duty. For most custodians, the choice is clear. Their duty demands perfection. If they can no longer deliver perfection, they can no longer perform their duty. There is no room for compromise, no allowance for the sentiment that centuries of faithful service should earn a warrior the right to continue serving even after their capabilities have begun to wane. The Emperor's safety is not a matter of sentiment, it is an absolute. And a custodian who can no longer guarantee that absolute with every fiber of their being is a custodian who has no place among the 10,000. The process of stepping down is conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterizes everything about the custodian. There is no ceremony, no grand farewell, no speeches or honors or public acknowledgement of the service that is ending. The custodian simply makes the decision, communicates it to their superiors, and begins the process of divesting themselves of everything that marks them as one of the Emperor's guard. The armor comes off first. That golden shell that has been the custodian's second skin for centuries. The auramite plates that bear the inscriptions of their accumulated names. The helmet that has framed their view of the world for as long as they can remember. Each piece is carefully removed, inspected, and returned to the Hall of Armaments, where it will be maintained in perpetual readiness for the day when it might be fitted to a new custodian. The warrior who wore it is not sentimental about its loss. The armor belongs to the duty, not to the individual. When the duty ends, the armor returns to the duty. Next come the weapons. The guardian spear, or whatever weapon the custodian favored during their service. This too, is returned to the armory, not destroyed, not melted down, not repurposed, preserved, because these weapons are irreplaceable works of art, each one a unique creation that represents centuries of service, and that carries within it a history of battles fought and enemies defeated that gives it a kind of spiritual significance that transcends its physical form. And finally, the custodian dons a simple black robe, no gold, no heraldry, no marks of rank or identification. A plain, hooded garment that conceals the massive transhuman body beneath its folds, and that announces, to anyone who knows what to look for, that the person wearing it has stepped beyond the boundary that separates the 10,000 from the rest of humanity. Then they leave. They walk out of the Imperial Palace. Through the gates, they have spent their entire existence guarding, and they disappear into the vastness of the galaxy. No fanfare, no escorts, no final inspection or farewell formation. They simply go. One moment they are there, a golden warrior standing among their brothers. The next moment they are gone, a hooded figure in a black robe, walking through the crowds of Terra's hive cities, indistinguishable from a million other hooded figures in a galaxy where anonymity is as common as suffering. But their service is not truly over, because those who leave the Custodes in this way become the eyes of the Emperor. a secretive sect of former custodians who serve as the organization's intelligence network across the breadth of the Imperium. Stripped of their golden armor and their legendary weapons, yet clad in nothing but their black robes and the enhanced body that the bioalchemy gave them, they travel the galaxy alone, watching for threats that could endanger Terra and the Emperor. The eyes of the Emperor are an extraordinary phenomenon within the broader context of the 40k universe. Consider what these individuals represent. They are beings of immense physical power, stronger and faster and more resilient than all but the most powerful opponents they might encounter. They are beings of formidable intellect, trained in every field of knowledge that the Custodes consider relevant to the Emperor's protection, which is to say, every field of knowledge in existence. They are beings of absolute loyalty, their dedication to the Emperor woven into the very fabric of their cellular structure by the bioalchemy that created them. Yes, and they are invisible, completely, utterly invisible. No one knows who they are. No one knows what they look like. They do not carry identification. They do not announce their presence. They do not operate through official channels or claim any kind of authority. They are simply there, moving through the population of the Imperium like ghosts, watching everything, saying nothing, reporting back to the Custodes through secret channels when they detect a threat significant enough to warrant attention. Some of them work alone, solitary watchers who rely on their own senses and their own judgment to identify potential threats. Others cultivate networks of informants and agents, building intelligence organizations from scratch in the worlds and systems they pass through. They use every tool at their disposal, from subtle psychological manipulation to outright intimidation, to secure the cooperation of the people they need. Because even without their armor and their weapons, a former custodian is a terrifying presence. Their enhanced physiology makes them virtually impossible to kill by conventional means. Their training in combat, espionage, and psychological warfare makes them dangerous beyond measure, and the quiet certainty that radiates from them, the unmistakable sense that this is a person who has stood in the presence of the Emperor and who carries his authority within them like a flame that will never go out, is enough to make even the most hardened criminal or the most powerful planetary governor think twice about refusing their requests. When the eyes of the Emperor identify a threat, the response is swift and devastating. But the intelligence gathered by the former custodians is transmitted back to Terra through channels that are so secure and so deeply encrypted that even the Inquisition cannot intercept them. The information is analyzed by the Custodes' intelligence apparatus, cross-referenced with other sources of intelligence, and used to target shield host deployments with surgical precision. The result is that enemies of the Imperium who believe themselves safe suddenly find golden warriors descending upon them without warning. Warlords who thought their fortress worlds were impregnable discover that the Custodes have already mapped their defenses, identified their vulnerabilities, and planned their assault with a level of detail that would make an inquisitor weep with professional jealousy. Or traitors who have spent years building their conspiracies in secret discover that someone has been watching them the entire time, cataloging their movements, recording their communications, and waiting for the moment when the Custodes would find it most advantageous to strike. This is the power of the eyes of the Emperor. Not military power, though a former custodian is more than capable of killing entire squads of enemy soldiers with their bare hands if the situation demands it. Intelligence power, the power that comes from knowing what your enemies are planning before they plan it, from understanding their capabilities and their intentions better than they understand themselves, from being able to position your forces in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to deliver a killing blow that your enemies never see coming. And it all comes from warriors who have supposedly retired, warriors who have been deemed no longer fit for active duty, warriors whose reaction times have slowed by 1/10 of a second. It is a humbling thought. The beings that the Custodes consider insufficient for active service are still more dangerous than virtually any other individual in the galaxy. Their retirement is not a withdrawal from service, but a transformation of service, a shift from the direct protection of the Emperor's physical form to the indirect protection of his interests across the breadth of the Imperium. They do not stop serving. they cannot stop serving. Service is what they are. It is written into their cells, encoded in the very structure of their being, and no amount of physical degradation or passage of time can erase it. Some eyes of the Emperor, and particularly those who are still relatively newly retired and who remain on Terra, have been known to request interment within a venerable Contemptor dreadnought. This is a last resort, a final option for those who cannot bear the thought of leaving the palace and who would rather be sealed within a walking tomb of metal and ceramic than abandon their post entirely. The decision is not taken lightly, and it is not made often, but it speaks to the depth of the Custodian's dedication that some would choose mechanical imprisonment over freedom, simply because the mechanical form would allow them to continue standing guard over the Emperor in a way that their deteriorating flesh no longer permits. Now let us take a step back from the specifics of Custodian existence and consider the broader philosophical questions that their existence raises. But because the Custodes are not merely a military organization or a bodyguard detail, however extraordinary, they are a statement, a philosophical proposition made manifest in golden armor and transhuman flesh. And the proposition they represent is this, that the ultimate expression of human potential is not power, not glory, not conquest or domination, but service. Consider what the Emperor created when he designed the Custodes. He did not create conquerors. He did not create rulers. He did not create weapons of mass destruction or engines of imperial expansion. He created servants, the most powerful, the most capable, the most extraordinary servants the galaxy has ever known, but servants nonetheless. Every aspect of the Custodian transformation, from the physical enhancement to the intellectual education to the spiritual tempering, is directed toward a single end, the creation of a being who is perfectly suited to serve. This is a radical philosophical statement in the context of the 40k universe, where power is everything, and those who possess it invariably use it to advance their own interests. The Primarchs were created with power, and most of them eventually turned that power to their own purposes, whether those purposes aligned with the Emperor's vision or stood in direct opposition to it. The Space Marines were created as instruments of conquest, and they have always defined themselves by the enemies they have defeated and the territories they have claimed. The various organs of imperial government, from the administratum to the mechanicus to the ecclesiarchy, all exist to extend and maintain the power of the Imperium, and all of them are constantly competing with one another for influence and resources. The Custodes stand apart from all of this. They do not seek power. They do not compete for influence. They do not define themselves by their victories or their conquests. They define themselves by their duty, by the simple, unwavering, unchanging fact that they are the Emperor's servants, and that serving him is their entire reason for existing. This is why no Custodian has ever fallen to chaos, not because of their physical resilience, though that certainly helps, not because of the aegis of the Emperor, though that provides an additional layer of protection, but because the Custodian psychology is fundamentally incompatible with the lure of the dark gods. Chaos offers power in exchange for service, but the Custodes already serve. They serve with a totality and a completeness that leaves no room for the seductive whispers of the warp. There is nothing that chaos can offer them that they do not already have, because what they have, what they value above all else, is the duty itself. And the duty cannot be corrupted, because the duty is pure. It is the purest thing in the Imperium, the simple, uncomplicated act of standing between the Emperor and whatever threatens him, asking for nothing in return but the chance to continue standing. There is a beauty in that, if you can see past the grimdark exterior of the 40k setting to the human truths that lie beneath. The Custodes embody a truth that transcends their fictional origins, that the highest expression of power is not the ability to dominate others, but the willingness to serve something greater than yourself. That strength is not measured by what you can take, but by what you are willing to give. That the truest form of immortality is not the indefinite extension of biological life, but the endurance of a purpose that outlasts any individual lifetime. This is why the Custodians resonate with people on a level that goes beyond simple appreciation for cool armor and impressive weapons. They represent something aspirational, something that speaks to the part of every person that wants to believe that dedication matters, that service has value, that standing for something bigger than yourself is not only possible, but meaningful. Now let us talk about what the Custodians represent in the broader context of the Imperium's military hierarchy, because their existence raises interesting questions about the relationship between quality and quantity in warfare. The Imperium is, at its core, a war machine that relies on numbers. The Imperial Guard deploys billions of soldiers across thousands of fronts. The Space Marines, for all their individual power, are effective primarily because they operate as a force multiplier for the conventional military assets that do the bulk of the fighting. The Imperium wins its wars through attrition, through the willingness to absorb staggering casualties and keep fighting until the enemy runs out of resources or will. The Custodians represent the opposite end of this spectrum. They are the ultimate expression of quality over quantity. Each Custodian represents an investment of resources and expertise so vast that it makes the creation of a Space Marine look like mass production. And there are only 10,000 of them, compared to the million or so Space Marines who serve across the Imperium's 1,000 chapters, and the trillions of ordinary soldiers who fill the ranks of the Imperial Guard. To illustrate just how vast the gulf between a Custodian and a Space Marine truly is, consider the matter of sensory experience. A Space Marine possesses enhanced senses that are impressive by any standard. Their eyes can see in near total darkness. Their ears can detect sounds at frequencies inaudible to normal humans. Their sense of smell can pick up trace chemicals in the air. These enhancements make them formidable scouts and trackers, are capable of operating in environments that would blind and deafen ordinary soldiers. A Custodian's sensory capabilities make a Space Marines look primitive. The bioalchemy does not merely enhance the existing senses, it rewrites the entire sensory system from the ground up, creating pathways of perception that have no equivalent in standard human biology. A Custodian can detect the bioelectric field generated by a living body through several meters of solid wall. They can taste the chemical composition of the air with a precision that rivals laboratory instruments. They can feel the vibrations of footsteps through the floor at distances that would be impossible for any conventional sensor to detect. Their visual acuity allows them to read text at distances that would require a Space Marine to use magnification optics. And their capacity to process all of this sensory information simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed or distracted is a testament to the quality of the neural architecture that the Jinrites have constructed within their enhanced brains. Every Custodian is, in effect, a walking sensor platform of extraordinary sophistication, and the information they gather through their senses is processed through an intellect that can draw conclusions and identify patterns at a speed that would shame most cogitator systems. This raises an obvious question. Why does the Imperium not simply create more Custodians? If a single Custodian is worth 100 Space Marines, and a single Space Marine is worth 100 Guardsmen, then surely the most efficient use of resources would be to pour everything into Custodian production and field an army of golden demigods, instead of a horde of expendable infantry. The answer is both practical and philosophical. On the practical side, the Custodian creation process cannot be scaled up. It requires specific genetic material from Terran nobility, the expertise of the Jinrites, whose knowledge cannot be replicated or transferred, the facilities and technologies hidden beneath the Imperial Palace that exist nowhere else in the galaxy, and decades of time for each individual candidate. Even if the resources were available to multiply the number of candidates tenfold, the Jinrites simply could not process them all. The bottleneck is not resources, but expertise and time, both of which are finite and irreplaceable. On the philosophical side, the Custodians were never intended to be an army. They were designed to be bodyguards, sentinels, and companions. Their role is not to win wars, but to prevent the one loss that would make all other victories meaningless. the loss of the Emperor. An army of custodians would be extraordinary on the battlefield, but it would represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what the custodes are for. They are not soldiers. They are guardians. And the guardian's role is not to march against the enemy, but to stand between the enemy and whatever is being guarded, no matter the cost. This distinction is crucial to understanding the custodian mindset. Space Marines glory in battle. They celebrate their victories and honor their fallen with rituals that emphasize martial prowess and competitive excellence. And the Imperial Guard takes pride in their ability to hold the line against impossible odds, finding meaning in the solidarity of shared suffering. The Custodes take pride in none of these things. For them, the ideal outcome is not a glorious victory, but a threat that never materializes. The perfect day for a custodian is a day when nothing happens. A day when the Emperor is safe, the palace is secure, and the defenses hold without being tested. They do not seek battle. They do not celebrate it when it comes. They endure it because it represents a failure of prevention, a threat that slipped through the net and had to be dealt with through violence rather than being neutralized before it could form. This attitude is sometimes mistaken for arrogance by those who do not understand the custodian mindset. Space Marines, in particular, have historically viewed the Custodes with a mixture of respect and resentment, seeing them as aloof warriors who look down on the Astartes from the comfort of their golden towers without ever having to face the reality of galactic warfare. This perception is not entirely inaccurate. The Custodes do look down on the Space Marines, though not from contempt, but from a position of knowledge. The Custodes know that the Space Marines failed, that half the legions turned traitor during the Horus Heresy, that the Emperor's own sons, the Primarchs, were corrupted by chaos. Every Space Marine who walks through the corridors of the Imperial Palace does so under the watchful, distrustful gaze of the Custodes, who will never forget and never forgive the betrayal that cost the Emperor his physical form and condemned him to an eternity on the Golden Throne. This distrust is not personal. No individual Space Marine alive today bears any responsibility for the actions of the traitor legions 10,000 years ago. But the Custodes think in terms of institutions, not individuals. The Adeptus Astartes, as an institution, has demonstrated that it is capable of betraying the Emperor. That fact cannot be undone. It cannot be explained away. It can only be remembered and guarded against. In the era Indomitus, with the return of Robuta Guilliman and the expansion of the Custodes' operational role, this dynamic has begun to shift. Custodians now fight alongside Space Marines on battlefields across the galaxy, and the experience of shared combat has begun to build a grudging mutual respect that was absent during the millennia of the Custodes' isolation on Terra. But the fundamental wariness remains. The Custodes watch the Space Marines. They always will, because that is their duty, and their duty does not have an expiration date. Before we reach our conclusion, there are several more facets of custodian existence that deserve thorough exploration. We have covered the broad strokes of their creation, their training, their equipment, and their traditions. But the lore of the Adeptus Custodes runs deeper than what we have discussed so far, and there are stories and details that add crucial layers of understanding to the question of what it truly means to become one of these golden warriors. Let us begin with the war within the Webway, but because this conflict more than any other defined the modern Custodes and shaped their relationship with the broader Imperium. The Webway was supposed to be humanity's salvation. The Emperor, in his infinite ambition, had conceived of a project that would free the Imperium from its dependence on warp travel. The warp, that hellish dimension of psychic energy through which humanity's starships traveled between systems, was inherently dangerous. Ships could be lost, delayed, or corrupted during transit. The creatures that dwelt within the warp, demons and worse, posed a constant threat to any vessel passing through their domain. And the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the warp, required the constant sacrifice of thousands of psykers to maintain. It was an imperfect system. It's a dangerous compromise that the Emperor intended to replace with something far better. The webway was that replacement. An ancient network of extra-dimensional tunnels originally constructed by the Eldari, the webway allowed instantaneous travel between points separated by vast distances of real space without passing through the warp at all. The Emperor had discovered a way to access the webway from beneath the Imperial Palace, and he had begun the process of expanding and modifying the network to serve humanity's needs. If the project succeeded, the Imperium would have a transportation network that was faster, safer, and more reliable than anything the warp could offer. Humanity would no longer need to risk its ships and its people in the realm of nightmares every time it wanted to move between star systems. The project was the Emperor's most closely guarded secret. Only a handful of beings in the entire Imperium knew about it. The Custodes were among them because they were always among the Emperor's innermost circle of confidence. They provided security for the project, guarding the entrance to the webway tunnel that opened beneath the Imperial Palace, and ensuring that no unauthorized personnel gained access to what was arguably the most important construction project in human history. And then Magnus the Red destroyed everything. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns, warned by prophetic visions that his brother Horus had fallen to chaos and was about to turn traitor, used his formidable psychic powers to send a warning to the Emperor. The problem was that Magnus had been forbidden from using psychic powers by the Edict of Nicaea, and the Emperor had specifically warned him about the dangers of breaching the psychic wards that protected the webway project. Magnus, driven by desperation and a sincere desire to save his father, ignored these warnings and used his power to punch through the barriers between the warp and the material world. The result was catastrophic. Magnus's psychic message reached the Emperor, but the barriers protecting the webway were shattered in the process. A hole was torn in the dimensional fabric that separated the webway from the warp, and through that hole poured an endless tide of demons. The carefully constructed tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace became a corridor straight to the heart of the Imperium's capital, and the forces of chaos wasted no time in exploiting this sudden, unexpected breach in humanity's defenses. The Emperor himself was forced to take a position on the Golden Throne, using his immense psychic power to hold the breach shut and prevent the demons from pouring directly into the Imperial Palace. But the breach could not be sealed from the throne alone. The demons were already inside the webway, and they would continue to attack the breach from the other side until they were driven back or destroyed. That task fell to the Custodes. The war that followed was unlike anything the Golden Warriors had ever experienced. They fought in the tunnels and chambers of the webway, a labyrinthine network of extra-dimensional corridors that stretched in impossible directions and that obeyed laws of geometry and physics that bore little resemblance to the rules of the material world. The light was wrong. The distances were wrong. The very concept of direction and orientation became unreliable as corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied spatial logic, and the enemies they faced were not the mortal adversaries that the Custodes had trained to fight. They were demons, manifestations of the Chaos God's power, given temporary physical form by the psychic energy of the warp. They came in all shapes and sizes, from gibbering hordes of lesser entities that attacked in waves of overwhelming numbers to towering greater demons, whose presence alone was enough to drive mortal men insane. They attacked with weapons forged from concepts rather than metal. They fought with strength drawn from the nightmares and fears of every living being in the galaxy. And they could not truly be killed, only banished temporarily back to the warp, as from which they would inevitably return to resume the assault. The Custodes fought them with everything they had. Their guardian spears cut through demonic flesh with the same devastating efficiency that they brought to bear against mortal enemies. Their auramite armor, touched by the Emperor's own power, provided protection against the warp-infused attacks of the demons that would have consumed lesser warriors. And the aegis of the Emperor, that spark of divine energy that burned within every custodian, served as a personal ward against the corrupting influence of the chaos entities that surrounded them. But the demons were endless. For every one that was banished, 10 more appeared. For every corridor that was cleared, 3 more were overrun. The Custodes were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could not be permanently defeated, and that drew its strength from a source of power that was, for all practical purposes, infinite. It was a war they could not win. All they could do was delay, to hold the line long enough for the Emperor to find a permanent solution to the breach. The war lasted for approximately 5 years. 5 years of continuous combat, without rest, without relief, without the hope of a decisive victory that would end the fighting once and for all. 5 years during which the Custodes were ground down, battle by battle, corridor by corridor, their numbers shrinking as warriors fell to wounds that even their enhanced biology could not heal, or succumb to the accumulated exhaustion of fighting without pause for months on end. When the war finally ended, when the Emperor was forced to seal the webway permanently and abandon his greatest project to focus on defending Terra against the approaching forces of Horus, the Custodes had been reduced from 10,000 to approximately 1,000. 9/10 of the Emperor's Golden Guard, the warriors who had stood at his side since before the founding of the Imperium, were dead, gone. Lost in the tunnels of the webway, their bodies left in the ruins of a dream that would never be realized. The emotional impact of this loss on the surviving Custodes is difficult to overstate. These were not strangers to one another. The Custodes, for all their emphasis on individuality, shared a genetic kinship and a bond of service that connected them to one another in ways that outsiders could never fully understand. Each fallen Custodian was a brother or sister in arms, a companion who had walked the same corridors and stood the same vigils and fought the same enemies for centuries. Each loss was felt personally, deeply, in a way that the military casualties of the broader Imperium could never replicate. And the worst part was that it had all been for nothing. The Webway project was destroyed. The Emperor's vision of a humanity freed from the dangers of warp travel died in those tunnels, buried under the weight of demonic flesh and the bitter ashes of a dream that had come so tantalizingly close to realization before being snatched away. The surviving Custodes carried that failure with them, a wound that ran deeper than any physical injury and that never fully healed. The war within the Webway also profoundly shaped the Custodes' relationship with the Space Marines and the Primarchs. Magnus the Red's actions, however well-intentioned, had caused the catastrophe. A Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, had through his arrogance and his inability to follow orders, brought about the destruction of the Emperor's most important project and the deaths of 9,000 of the Emperor's most cherished warriors. The Custodes had always been suspicious of the Primarchs and their legions. After the Webway War, that suspicion hardened into something closer to permanent, implacable distrust. This is the background against which the Siege of Terra played out. 1,000 surviving Custodians, grieving the loss of their brothers and sisters, carrying the weight of a failed duty, now faced the prospect of defending the Imperial Palace against the combined forces of 9 traitor legions. The odds were impossible, the stakes were absolute, and the Custodes did what they had always done. They stood their ground, and they fought. We have already discussed some aspects of the siege in relation to Valdor's personal story, but let us consider the broader experience of the Custodes during this defining moment in their history. The Siege of Terra was the largest and most devastating battle ever fought in human history up to that point. The traitor legions descended upon the throne world with millions of warriors, supported by Titan legions, demonic entities, corrupted war machines, and the full, terrible power of the Chaos Gods themselves. The defenders, led by the Primarchs Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, and the Khan, along with the surviving Custodes and millions of Imperial army soldiers, faced an enemy that outnumbered them and outgunned them by a significant margin. The Custodes were initially held in reserve during the early phases of the siege, their depleted numbers too precious to risk in the grinding attritional warfare that characterized the outer defense rings. But as the traitors broke through one fortification after another, pushing deeper and deeper toward the heart of the palace, the Golden Warriors were eventually committed to the fight. When they entered the battle, the effect was immediate and transformative. The mere sight of golden armor advancing through the smoke and rubble of the shattered defenses sent a wave of renewed determination through the loyalist forces and a chill of recognition through the traitors, many of whom still remembered the Golden Warriors from the days before the rebellion, and who understood exactly what their appearance on the battlefield meant. The Custodians fought with a fury that stunned even the traitor Astartes, who had faced every manner of opponent across the galaxy during the Great Crusade. The Golden Warriors moved through the enemy formations like fire through dry grass, their guardian spears cutting down traitor space marines with an efficiency that bordered on the contemptuous. The Emperor-forged nature of the Custodes made them uniquely effective against chaos-corrupted opponents, and the traitors quickly learned to fear the sight of golden armor more than any other element of the Imperial defense. But even the Custodes could not hold back the tide forever. The traitors were too numerous, too powerful, and too driven by the dark energies that their patron gods poured into them. The defense of the Imperial Palace was a desperate, grinding affair that consumed lives at a rate that would have been unsustainable for any other fighting force in the galaxy. The Custodes took casualties that they could not afford, losing warriors whose creation had required decades of investment and whose experience represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. When the Emperor finally teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit for his final confrontation with Horus, the surviving Custodes were left behind to continue the defense of the palace. They did not falter. They did not break. They continued fighting with the same unwavering determination that had characterized their entire existence, holding their positions against impossible odds until the battle was finally decided by events occurring far above them, in the throne room of a traitor's flagship. The aftermath of the siege left the Custodes in a state that could only be described as devastated. Their numbers had been reduced still further by the fighting, and the Emperor, their lord and master, the being for whom they had been created and to whom they had dedicated every moment of their existence, was now trapped on the Golden Throne, not dead, but not truly alive either. Suspended in a state between life and death by the arcane technologies of the throne, his physical form a withered ruin, his consciousness turned inward to maintain the Astronomicon and hold shut the breach in the webway that Magnus had created. For the Custodes, the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne was not merely a political crisis or a military setback. It was a personal catastrophe of the highest order. They had been created to stand beside him, to protect him, to serve as his companions and his guardians. They had failed. Despite everything they had done, despite every sacrifice they had made, the Emperor was wounded, imprisoned, and effectively dead to the world. The Custodian who stood guard over the Golden Throne was not merely performing a duty. They were bearing witness to their own failure, every moment of every day for the rest of eternity. This is the emotional reality that underlies the 10,000-year vigil of the Custodes. It is not merely dedication or discipline that keeps them at their posts. It is grief. It is guilt. It is the weight of a failure that can never be redeemed and that will never be forgotten. Every Custodian who has served since the heresy carries that weight, whether they were alive when the Emperor fell or were created centuries later. The knowledge of what happened, the awareness of how close they came to losing everything, is woven into the fabric of the organization as surely as the Emperor's genetic legacy is woven into the fabric of their cells. Let us also discuss the Custodes' relationship with the Sisters of Silence, because this partnership reveals important aspects of Custodian philosophy and military doctrine. The Sisters of Silence, formerly known as the Anathema Psychana, are an all-female military order composed of psychic blanks, individuals who possess the extremely rare pariah gene that makes them invisible to the warp and anathema to psychers and psychic entities. In their presence, psychic powers fail, demonic manifestations weaken and dissolve, and even ordinary humans experience a profound sense of unease and wrongness that makes it difficult to remain in their company for extended periods. Together with the Custodians, the Sisters of Silence form the talons of the Emperor's right and left hands in the war against the enemies of mankind. Where the Custodes represent the Emperor's physical might and martial supremacy, the Sisters represent his psychic authority and his rejection of the corruption that threatens humanity from the warp. Whilst the partnership between the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence is one of the most effective military alliances in the Imperium. The Custodians provide overwhelming physical combat capability, the ability to destroy any enemy through sheer martial prowess and superior weaponry. The Sisters provide psychic denial, the ability to shut down enemy psykers, banish demonic entities, and create zones of warp silence that cripple the supernatural capabilities of chaos-aligned forces. Together, they are almost unstoppable. An enemy who relies on psychic powers finds those powers neutralized by the Sisters' aura of blankness. An enemy who relies on physical combat finds themselves overwhelmed by the Custodians' superior strength, speed, and skill. An enemy who tries to use both is caught in a vice between two forces that complement each other perfectly, each covering the other's vulnerabilities and amplifying the other's strengths. But the relationship between the Custodians and the Sisters goes beyond simple military cooperation. There is a deep mutual respect between the two organizations that is rare in the Imperium, where inter-organizational rivalries and territorial disputes are the norm. The Custodians respect the Sisters for their unique abilities and for the sacrifice that their existence represents. Being a psychic blank is not a gift, it is a burden. The Sisters are shunned by ordinary humans, who find their presence instinctively disturbing. They cannot form the psychic bonds that connect most humans to one another at a subconscious level. They are, in a very real sense, us alone in a universe full of connected souls. The Custodians understand this isolation because they experience their own version of it. The Custodians' transhuman nature sets them apart from ordinary humanity, just as surely as the Sisters' blankness does. Both groups exist in a kind of exile from the human mainstream, too different to be truly part of the world they protect, too dedicated to their duty to dwell on the implications of their isolation. This shared experience of otherness creates a bond between the two organizations that transcends their differences in origin, capability, and purpose. During the war within the Webway, the Sisters of Silence fought alongside the Custodians, their psychic nullifying abilities proving invaluable against the demonic hordes that poured through the breach. Yet the partnership was forged in blood and fire and desperation, and it has endured for 10,000 years since, a testament to the power of shared purpose and mutual respect. Now let us address one final aspect of Custodian existence that is often overlooked, but that is crucial to understanding the full picture of what it means to become one of these warriors. Let us talk about the Custodian's relationship with death. We have discussed the functional immortality of the Custodians, their resistance to aging, and the gradual deterioration that eventually leads to their retirement as eyes of the Emperor. But we have not fully explored what death means to a Custodian who falls in battle, and how that death is commemorated by those who survive. When a Custodian dies, the event is treated with a gravity that is proportional to the investment that their creation represented. Every Custodian is, as we have discussed, a unique creation, the product of decades of painstaking bioalchemy and training. They cannot be mass-produced. They cannot be easily replaced. The loss of a single Custodian represents a diminishment of the Emperor's guard that cannot be quickly or cheaply rectified. The giant bell of lost souls, one of the most famous landmarks on Terra, is rung whenever a Custodian falls. This bell, whose sonorous toll can be heard across the entirety of the Imperial Palace and far beyond, serves as a reminder to the entire population of Terra that one of the Emperor's golden warriors has been lost. In a galaxy where billions die every day in the Imperium's endless wars, the death of a single Custodian is considered significant enough to warrant a public announcement of mourning that echoes across an entire planet. Within the Custodians themselves, the death of a comrade is felt deeply and personally, though it is not always expressed in ways that outsiders would recognize as grief. The Custodians' enhanced emotional discipline, their training in maintaining composure under the most extreme circumstances, means that they do not weep or rage or collapse in the visible displays of sorrow that characterize human mourning. Instead, they honor their fallen by continuing to serve, by carrying forward the duty that their dead comrade can no longer perform, and by ensuring that the sacrifice was not in vain. But the fallen Custodians' armor and weapons are recovered whenever possible and returned to the Hall of Armaments, where they are maintained as sacred relics. The names inscribed on the interior of the armor are preserved, a record of service that will endure long after the warrior who earned those names has passed beyond the reach of memory. In some cases, the armor may eventually be refitted for a new Custodian, creating a physical link between the fallen warrior and their successor that transcends time and death. The Custodians' accumulated names are added to the rolls of honor that are maintained in the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace. These records stretch back to the earliest days of the Unification Wars, as a continuous catalogue of service and sacrifice that documents every Custodian who has ever lived and every deed they performed in the Emperor's name. It is, in effect, a memorial that encompasses 10,000 years of devotion, a monument to the courage and dedication of every golden warrior who has ever drawn breath. There is no afterlife in the Custodian belief system. The Custodes are generally not religious, and they do not share the ecclesiarchy's faith in the Emperor as a divine being who awaits his faithful servants in some celestial realm beyond death. When a Custodian dies, the Custodes believe they simply cease to exist. There is no reward, no paradise, no reunion with fallen comrades in some golden hall beyond the stars. There is only the service that they performed while they lived, and the legacy that their service leaves behind. This belief, or rather this lack of belief, gives Custodian deaths a particular poignancy. These are beings who face oblivion every time they enter combat, and they do so without the comfort of faith in an afterlife, or the hope that their sacrifice will be rewarded by some higher power. They fight and die, knowing that death is the end, that everything they are, everything they have been, everything they might have become, will be extinguished when the last spark of consciousness fades from their enhanced minds. And they do it anyway. They walk into the fire anyway. They stand against impossible odds anyway. They give their lives to protect the Emperor anyway, not because they believe they will be rewarded, but because the duty demands it, because the duty is its own reward, because the act of service, the simple, uncomplicated dedication of one's existence to something greater than oneself, is worth more than any promise of paradise or threat of damnation. That is the essence of what it means to be a Custodian. Not the golden armor, not the superhuman strength, not the bioalchemy or the ancient weapons or the political authority. The essence is the choice. The conscious, deliberate, unwavering choice to serve, to protect, to give everything you are to a cause that will outlive you, knowing that you will receive nothing in return but the satisfaction of knowing that you did your duty. It is a choice that is made for the Custodian, in a sense, by the bioalchemy that shapes them from infancy. But it is also a choice that is affirmed every day by every Custodian who continues to stand their vigil. Because the enhancement can create the capacity for service. It can instill the desire for duty. It can shape the body and the mind into the perfect instrument of protection. But it cannot make the choice for them. That is something each Custodian must do on their own, in the quiet hours of their eternal watch, when the weight of the duty presses down and the darkness crowds in and the question whispers at the edge of consciousness. Is this enough? Is this worth it? Is this who I choose to be? And every Custodian, every single one of the 10,000, answers yes. That is what makes them more than warriors, more than weapons, more than the sum of their genetic modifications and their training and their equipment. That is what makes them Custodians. Let us also take a moment to discuss what the Custodians mean to the ordinary citizens of the Imperium, because this external perspective adds an important dimension to our understanding of these warriors. To the average Imperial citizen, the Custodians are figures of myth and legend. Most humans will never see a Custodian in person. Most will never even meet someone who has seen a Custodian in person. The Golden Warriors exist at such a rarefied level of the Imperial hierarchy that they are effectively invisible to the teeming billions who live and die in the Imperium's hive cities and agri-worlds and forge factories. But they are known. Through the ecclesiarchy's propaganda, through the tales told by those fortunate enough to live near the Imperial Palace, through the works of art and literature that celebrate the Emperor's Guard, the Custodians have become one of the Imperium's most enduring symbols of protection and divine authority. They are depicted in murals on the walls of cathedrals. They appear in the illuminated manuscripts that are hand-copied by the ecclesiarchy's scribes and distributed to every world in the Imperium. They are referenced in hymns and prayers, invoked as the Emperor's own warriors who stand eternally between humanity and the darkness that seeks to consume it. For the Imperial citizen, the Custodians represent the ultimate reassurance. No matter how bad things get, no matter how dark the galaxy becomes, the Golden Warriors are still there. Still standing guard, still watching over the Emperor with the same unblinking vigilance that they have maintained for 10,000 years. If the Custodians still stand, then the Emperor still endures. And then if the Emperor still endures, then there is still hope. This symbolic importance should not be underestimated. In a galaxy where hope is the rarest and most precious commodity, where billions of humans live their entire lives in conditions of grinding poverty, constant danger, and unrelenting misery, the knowledge that the Emperor's Guard still stands is a lifeline. It is a reason to continue struggling, to continue fighting, to continue believing that the suffering is not meaningless and that the sacrifice is not in vain. The Custodians are aware of this symbolic role, though they do not seek it and do not particularly value it. They did not become Custodians to be symbols. They became Custodians to serve. But they understand that their existence has meaning beyond the immediate tactical reality of palace defense and threat elimination. They understand that they represent something to the people of the Imperium that transcends their military function, and they conduct themselves accordingly. When a Custodian appears in public, which is rare but does occur during certain ceremonial occasions and military deployments, the effect on the ordinary humans who witness their presence is profound. The golden armor, the towering stature, the aura of authority and purpose that radiates from every Custodian like heat from a furnace. All of these things combine to create an impression that is not easily forgotten. Witnesses describe the experience of seeing a Custodian in terms that border on the religious, as speaking of a sense of awe and reverence that goes beyond what even the most impressive space marine can inspire. This is not merely the result of impressive armor and physical presence. There is something else at work, something that the lore attributes to the spark of the Emperor's power that burns within every Custodian. That spark, that fragment of the Emperor's divine energy that was implanted during the bioalchemical transformation, radiates outward in ways that ordinary humans can sense, even if they cannot articulate what they are feeling. In the presence of a Custodian, people feel safer. They feel more confident. They feel a stirring of something that might be faith or might be hope, or might simply be the subconscious recognition that this is a being who was created by the Emperor himself and who carries within them a piece of his immortal will. It is a powerful thing, and it adds yet another layer to the already complex existence of the Custodian. Not only are they warriors, sentinels, scholars, spies, and servants, they are also, whether they wish it or not, walking icons of the Emperor's power and humanity's endurance. Living symbols of everything the Imperium claims to stand for, embodied in golden armor and transhuman flesh. As we draw this exploration to its close, let us return to the question that has been at the heart of everything we have discussed. What does it mean to become a Custodian? It means to be unmade and remade. To have everything you were before erased and replaced with something that is simultaneously greater and more constrained than any ordinary human life could be. It means to spend decades in a crucible of pain and transformation, emerging as a being that exists on the border between human and divine. It means to take a new name drawn from the deepest wells of human history and to spend the rest of your effectively immortal life earning additional names through acts of extraordinary service. It means to carry weapons that are worth more than planets, and to wear armor that has been forged from materials whose origins are lost in the mists of pre-imperial history. It means to study philosophy and art and diplomacy and the 1,000 other disciplines that the Emperor considered necessary for his companions to master. Yes, it means to fight with a skill and a ferocity that makes Space Marines look like amateurs, and to maintain that level of capability for centuries without ever allowing it to diminish. It means to stand guard over a being who has not moved or spoken in 10,000 years, knowing that the survival of the entire human species depends on your ability to protect his broken body from threats both external and internal. It means to watch as the Imperium that the Emperor built crumbles around you, as his vision is corrupted, and his legacy is squandered by the very people he created the Custodes to protect. It means to endure all of this without breaking, without faltering, without questioning the fundamental purpose that defines your existence. It means to grow old eventually in the way that only a custodian can grow old. Not through the visible deterioration of flesh and bone, but through the imperceptible erosion of capability that comes from having maintained peak performance for longer than most civilizations endure. It means to recognize that erosion in yourself, to accept it without bitterness or regret, and to make the choice to step down from the duty that has been your entire life, rather than continue serving at anything less than perfection. It means to don a black robe and walk away from everything you have known, disappearing into the galaxy as an eye of the Emperor, continuing to serve in a different way, watching and waiting and reporting back to the Golden Warriors who still stand the vigil that you can no longer maintain. And it means, ultimately, to face the fact that your service will end, whether in battle or in the quiet fading of a consciousness that has endured longer than it was ever meant to. The Custodian's watch will eventually come to an end, and when it does, there will be nothing waiting on the other side. No reward, no paradise, no rest, just the knowledge that you served, that you stood between the Emperor and the darkness, that for however long your vigil lasted, you held the line. That is what it means to become a custodian. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where hope is the rarest thing in the galaxy and every light is threatened by the encroaching dark, it is perhaps the most meaningful thing that any human being can become. To truly appreciate the magnitude of what a custodian becomes, it helps to examine in detail how their creation process compares to that of a space marine, because the differences illuminate the fundamental philosophy that separates these two orders of transhuman warriors. A space marine begins as a human adolescent, typically between the ages of 10 and 16, depending on the chapter's practices. The candidate is subjected to a series of trials, physical and psychological, designed to identify those with the genetic compatibility, mental fortitude, and physical resilience needed to survive the augmentation process. These trials are often brutal. Many chapters recruit from death worlds or feral worlds, where simple survival requires extraordinary toughness and resourcefulness. The trials strip away the weak and the unsuitable, leaving only those candidates who possess the raw material needed for the transformation. Once selected, the aspirant undergoes a process of surgical implantation that takes place over several years. 19 additional organs, each derived from the gene seed of the chapter's Primarch progenitor, are implanted in a specific sequence. The secondary heart, which provides backup cardiovascular function, the os modular, which strengthens and thickens the skeleton, the biscopia, which enhances muscular growth, the hemastomen, which improves blood efficiency, the Laramans organ, which causes blood to clot almost instantly, and so on, through the full complement of 19 organs, each one designed to enhance a specific aspect of the aspirant's biology, and each one requiring careful surgical implantation and a recovery period during which the body adjusts to the new organ's presence. This process is impressive. It is also, compared to the creation of a custodian, crude. That is not an insult to the apothecaries and chapter serfs who perform the augmentation. They work with the tools and knowledge available to them, and the results speak for themselves. Space Marines are extraordinary warriors who have served the Imperium with distinction for 10,000 years. But the process by which they are created is fundamentally a process of addition. You take a human body and you add things to it. New organs, new capabilities, new structures that layer on top of the existing biological framework without fundamentally altering what was already there. The creation of a custodian does not add to the body. It changes the body, every cell, every molecule, every strand of genetic material. Nothing is bolted on or sewn in. Instead, as the existing biology is systematically rewritten cell by cell over the course of decades, until the infant that entered the transformation chambers has been completely replaced by something new, something that grew from the same biological starting point, but that has been guided, shaped, and refined into a form that bears only superficial resemblance to the original. Consider the analogy of building construction. Creating a Space Marine is like taking an existing building, a sturdy, well-built structure with good bones, and adding new rooms, new floors, new features that expand its capabilities beyond what the original architect intended. The building is still recognizable as the same structure. Its foundations are unchanged. Its basic layout is preserved, but it has been significantly enhanced by the additions. Our creating a custodian is like demolishing the building down to its foundation stones and then rebuilding it from scratch, using the same location and some of the same materials but following a completely different architectural plan. The result is a new structure that occupies the same space as the old one, but that is fundamentally different in every way that matters. The walls are different. The rooms are different. The systems that provide heat and light and water are different. Even the foundation has been reinforced and redesigned to support the weight of a structure that is far larger and far more complex than anything the original foundation was meant to carry. This is why the creation of a custodian takes decades, while the creation of a Space Marine takes years. This is why the creation of a custodian must begin in infancy, while the creation of a Space Marine begins in adolescence. The younger the subject, the more malleable their biology, the more responsive their cells to the kind of fundamental rewriting that the bioalchemy requires. An adolescent's body has already developed along established lines. Their cells have differentiated into specialized forms. Their genetic programming has already expressed itself in the growth of organs, bones, muscles, and neural structures that resist modification. Working with an adolescent body means working against the body's established developmental trajectory, which is why the Space Marine augmentation relies on adding new organs rather than modifying existing ones. An infant's body, by contrast, is still in the earliest stages of development. The cells are still dividing rapidly. The genetic programming is still being expressed for the first time. The biological systems that will eventually become organs and bones and muscles and nerves are still in a state of flux, responsive to influence in ways that an older body is not. By beginning the bioalchemy at this stage, the Genurites can guide the body's natural development along entirely new pathways, steering the growth of every cell and every structure toward the template that will eventually produce a fully realized custodian. This is also why the mortality rate among custodian candidates is so high. The process of rewriting a developing body's biology is extraordinarily delicate. A single error at any point in the decades-long procedure can cascade through the entire system, or producing chain reactions of cellular failure that kill the candidate within hours. The Genurites work with the care and precision of artists painting a masterpiece, one brushstroke at a time. knowing that a single misplaced line could ruin the entire work. The gene seed that defines a Space Marine's augmentation is also fundamentally different from whatever template the Custodian's bioalchemy uses. Space Marine gene seed is derived from a Primarch, one of the Emperor's 20 sons. Each Primarch's genetic material carries specific traits that are expressed in the Space Marines created from their gene seed. Ultramarines share characteristics derived from Guilliman. Blood Angels carry the genetic legacy of Sanguinius. Space Wolves reflect the nature of Leman Russ. And this connection to a Primarch gives each chapter a distinct identity and a set of unique characteristics, but it also means that the genetic template is ultimately derivative. It is a copy of a copy, filtered through the Primarch's own biology before being passed down to the Space Marines. The Custodians have no Primarch. They have no gene seed. Their template is drawn directly from the Emperor himself, or at least that is what the available evidence suggests. The spark of the Emperor's own power that burns within every Custodian, the aegis that protects them from psychic attack and warp corruption, the almost supernatural awareness that allows them to anticipate threats before they materialize. All of these things point to a connection between the Custodians and the Emperor that is more direct and more intimate than the connection between any Space Marine and their Primarch. This directness is reflected in the absolute, unquestionable loyalty that every Custodian displays. Space Marines can be corrupted. The Horus Heresy proved that beyond any doubt. The gene seed that connects them to their Primarch is also a vector through which the Primarch's flaws and vulnerabilities can be transmitted. The gene curse of the Blood Angels, the beast within the Space Wolves, the cold fury of the Iron Hands. These are all expressions of genetic vulnerabilities that were present in the Primarch and that are replicated in their sons. The Custodians have no such vulnerabilities. Their connection to the Emperor is not mediated through a Primarch. It is direct, pure, unfiltered. And the Emperor, whatever he truly was the one being in the galaxy who was genuinely, completely, absolutely incorruptible. Whatever spark of his essence burns within the Custodians carries with it that same incorruptibility, that same immovable resistance to the seductions of chaos that made the Emperor the ultimate anathema to the dark gods. Now let us talk briefly about Trajan Valoris, the current Captain General, because his leadership represents the most significant shift in Custodian philosophy and practice since the Horus Heresy. Valoris is the 17th individual to hold the position of Captain General, and by all accounts, he has proven himself worthy of the extraordinary legacy that comes with the title. He is described as a warrior of formidable martial prowess, while as a strategist of considerable skill, and a leader whose personal example inspires even the hardened veterans of the 10,000 to greater heights of dedication and performance. But Valoris's most significant contribution to the Custodes is not military, it is philosophical. Under his leadership, the Custodes have embraced a doctrine that would have been considered heretical by his predecessors. The idea that the best way to protect the Emperor is not simply to defend the Imperial Palace, but to actively seek out and destroy threats before they can reach Terra. This is a profound shift. For 10,000 years, the Custodes operated under the Edict of Restraint, limiting their activities to the defense of the palace and the immediate vicinity of Terra. This was a conservative approach, and driven by the trauma of the Horus Heresy and the war within the Webway, events that had demonstrated in the most brutal possible way what could happen when the Custodes left the Emperor's side. The lesson seemed clear. Stay close to the Emperor. Never leave his side. Never again allow a threat to reach the Golden Throne because the warriors who should have been guarding it were somewhere else. Valoris challenged this thinking. He argued and eventually convinced the other Custodian leadership that the galaxy had changed. The Great Rift had torn the Imperium in half. The forces of chaos were stronger and more active than they had been since the heresy itself. Xenos threats were multiplying and evolving at a rate that the Imperium's conventional forces struggled to match. in this new, more dangerous reality. As a purely defensive posture was no longer sufficient. The threats facing the Emperor were too numerous, too varied, and too capable to be stopped by walls and fortifications alone. They had to be met in the field. They had to be destroyed at their source before they could grow strong enough to threaten terror directly. The decision to adopt this more aggressive posture was not taken lightly. It represented a fundamental break with 10,000 years of tradition, and tradition is not something that the Custodians discard casually. But Valoris made the case persuasively, and the results have vindicated his judgment. Shield hosts now operate across the galaxy, striking at threats that the Custodians have identified through the intelligence gathered by the eyes of the Emperor and the oracular doomscryers and alpha-level astropathic intercepts that operate within the Imperial Palace. These strikes are surgical, precise, and devastating. They are not the broad, frontline engagements that characterize conventional Imperial warfare. They are targeted eliminations designed to remove specific threats to the Emperor's safety, with the minimum expenditure of Custodian lives and the maximum impact on the enemy's capabilities. The results speak for themselves. In the era Indomitus, the Custodians have prevented dozens of incursions that would otherwise have reached the Sol system. They have destroyed warlords and cult leaders who were building forces for assaults on Terra. They have intervened in conflicts where the outcome could have had cascading consequences that eventually threatened the throne world. And they have done all of this while maintaining their core defensive capability, ensuring that the Imperial Palace remains the most heavily guarded structure in the galaxy. Valoris himself has led several of these operations personally, demonstrating the kind of lead-from-the-front leadership that the Custodians value above all else. He led the defense of the Imperial Palace during the Battle of Lion's Gate, when demonic hordes of Khorne breached the outer defenses and threatened to overwhelm the palace's garrison. His personal combat performance during that battle is described in terms that place him in the company of the greatest captain generals in history, as a warrior whose skill and ferocity on the battlefield matched his strategic acumen and his political skill. Under Valoris's leadership, the Custodians have also taken a more active role in the Indomitus Crusade, the galaxy-spanning military campaign launched by Reboot Guilliman to reunite the Imperium and push back the forces of chaos. Custodian forces have accompanied torchbearer fleets, carrying the technology to create Primaris Space Marines to existing chapters, serving as both honor guard for the priceless technology and as observers tasked with evaluating the loyalty and reliability of the chapters that receive it. This observer role is particularly interesting because it reflects the Custodians' deeply ingrained suspicion of the Adeptus Astartes. The gift of the Primaris is presented as a boon from the Emperor, a strengthening of the chapter's capabilities at a time when the Imperium desperately needs every advantage it can get. But the Custodians are not there just to deliver gifts. They are there to watch, to assess, to determine whether these chapters are still worthy of the Emperor's trust, and to report back to Terra if they detect any signs of wavering loyalty or creeping corruption. It is a characteristic Custodian approach. Trust nothing, verify everything, assume the worst and prepare accordingly, and never, ever let your guard down. Because the last time the Custodians trusted the Space Marines, the Horus Heresy happened, and the Custodians have very, very long memories. The Dark Cells deserve a brief mention as well, because they represent one of the most mysterious and unsettling aspects of the Custodians' responsibilities. Located deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that are sealed behind layers of physical, technological, and psychic protection, the Dark Cells contain prisoners that cannot be killed. The nature of these prisoners is one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. Even most Custodians do not know what lies in the deepest cells. Only the Shadowkeepers, the specialized suborder of the Custodians that maintains the Dark Cells, and the Captain General himself have full knowledge of the contents. What we do know is that the prisoners include entities and objects from the Age of Strife, relics of a time when humanity's mastery of technology had reached heights that the 41st millennium can barely imagine, and when the misuse of that technology had produced horrors that defied description. Well, some of these horrors were destroyed during the Unification Wars. Some were sealed away in the dark cells, judged too dangerous to be allowed to exist in the open, but too indestructible to be eliminated entirely. The Shadowkeepers guard these prisoners with a dedication that is extreme, even by Custodian standards. Their duty is not merely to prevent the prisoners from escaping. It is to ensure that no one, from any faction or organization, can gain access to the prisoners or the knowledge they represent. The Mechanicus would give much to study the technologies locked in the dark cells. The Inquisition would sell its collective soul for access to the intelligence that those prisoners could provide. But the Shadowkeepers turn them all away, because the risks of releasing that knowledge into the wider Imperium are too great. And because the Emperor sealed those cells for a reason, and the Custodes do not second-guess the Emperor's decisions. The existence of the dark cells adds another dimension to the Custodians' burden. They are not merely guarding the Emperor, they are guarding humanity from itself, from the consequences of its own past mistakes, from the temptation to repeat the errors that nearly destroyed the species during the Age of Strife. The Custodes stand between the Imperium and horrors that most people do not even know exist, holding the line against threats that have been waiting in the darkness beneath the Imperial Palace for 10,000 years, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when their jailer's vigilance finally falters. That moment has not come, and if the Custodes have anything to say about it, it never will. Now let us spend some time exploring the individual stories of notable Custodians beyond Constantine Valdor, because these personal histories give us a human window into what is otherwise a deliberately opaque organization. The Custodes, as we have discussed, are intensely private. They do not seek fame. They do not cultivate public personas. They do not tell stories of their own exploits the way Space Marine chapters maintain oral traditions of heroic deeds. But despite this institutional reticence, certain Custodians have left their mark on the historical record in ways that illuminate the broader Custodian experience. Take Amon Tauromacchian, a name that appears in the records of the Great Crusade era. Amon was one of the Custodians who served in close proximity to the Emperor during the final years before the Horus heresy, and his story provides one of the most intimate glimpses we have into what it was like to be a member of the Emperor's personal retinue during that period. Amon was a warrior of considerable accomplishment, but what made him notable was not his martial skill, which was extraordinary but unremarkable by Custodian standards. What set him apart was his capacity for observation, his ability to read people, to detect subtle shifts in mood and intention that escaped even other Custodians, made him invaluable as a Blood Games operative. But it also gave him a perspective on the unfolding heresy that was uncomfortably prescient. The records suggest that Amon noticed changes in the behavior of certain Primarchs and their legions well before those changes became obvious to the broader Imperium. The growing distance between Horus and his father, the increasing isolation of Lorgar after the censure at Monarchia, the strange, unsettling intensity that began to characterize the behavior of several other Primarchs in the years before the rebellion. Amon saw these things because he was trained to see them. He was trained to detect threats to the Emperor in their earliest, most embryonic form, before they had a chance to develop into something dangerous. Whether he reported these concerns and was ignored, or whether the signs he detected were too ambiguous to act upon, or whether the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that was being planned exceeded even a Custodian's ability to anticipate, we do not know. The records from this period are fragmentary and contradictory. They are filtered through 10,000 years of institutional revision and the inevitable distortions of a history that has become as much mythology as fact. But Amon's story illustrates something important about the Custodian experience: the burden of awareness. The Custodes see more than other people. They process information faster. They detect patterns and connections that escape even the most perceptive mortal minds. This is an asset in most circumstances, but it can also be a curse, because seeing a threat that you cannot prevent is a particular kind of torment. And for the Custodes who watched the heresy unfold, who saw the signs of betrayal accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon, but who were unable to convince those in power to take action. The fall of Horus must have been an experience of almost unbearable frustration. Then there is Diocletian Koros, a tribune of the Custodes, who served during the war within the webway. Diocletian's story is particularly significant because it provides one of the most detailed first-person perspectives we have on the experience of fighting in the webway, and because his interactions with the emperor during that conflict reveal aspects of the master of mankind that are seldom seen in other accounts. Diocletian was present during some of the most desperate fighting in the webway. He led forces against demonic incursions that would have overwhelmed any other military formation in the Imperium. He watched as fellow custodians, warriors he had trained with and fought beside for centuries, were torn apart by entities that had no business existing in the material universe, and he endured, battle after battle, year after year, sustained by the same unbreakable sense of duty that defines every custodian. But it was his conversations with the emperor that truly defined Diocletian's contribution to the historical record. During the Webway War, the emperor was forced to remain on the Golden Throne for extended periods, using his psychic power to hold the breach shut. During these periods, he sometimes spoke with the custodians who guarded him, offering observations and insights that ranged from tactical commentary to philosophical reflection. The conversations between the emperor and Diocletian, as recorded in the available lore, are among the most revealing glimpses we have into the mind of the master of mankind. The emperor speaks of his plans for humanity with a frankness that he rarely displays in other interactions. He acknowledges the possibility of failure. He discusses the nature of the Chaos Gods with a clinical detachment that suggests an understanding of those entities far deeper than anything possessed by any other being in the Imperium. And he treats Diocletian not as a servant or a tool, but as something approaching an equal, a being worthy of honest communication and genuine engagement. This is important because it speaks to the nature of the relationship between the emperor and his custodians. The emperor created many things during his long existence. He created the Primarchs, the Space Marine Legions, the Astronomicon, the Golden Throne, and 1,000 other wonders of science and psychic power. But of all his creations, the Custodes were the ones he kept closest. They were the ones he spoke to most freely. They were the ones he trusted with his physical safety, which was perhaps the ultimate expression of trust from a being who had survived for tens of thousands of years by trusting no one. The Custodes were not just bodyguards. They were the emperor's family, the closest thing he had to personal relationships in a life that was defined by duty and sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of a vision so vast that it encompassed the entire future of the human species. The Primarchs were his sons in a biological and philosophical sense, but the relationship was always complicated by the immense expectations he placed on them and by the political realities of the Great Crusade. The Custodes were something simpler, something purer. They were the beings who stood beside him because they chose to, because their entire existence was oriented toward his protection, and because that shared purpose created a bond that required no explanation or justification. This is why the emperor's incapacitation on the Golden Throne hit the Custodes so hard. It was not just a military disaster or a political crisis, it was a personal loss. The being around whom their entire existence was organized, the being they had been created to serve and protect and accompany, was gone. Not dead, but unreachable. Sealed away behind the psychic machinery of the Golden Throne, his consciousness turned inward to maintain the Astronomicon, his body a withered shell that bore no resemblance to the golden figure who had once walked among them as their lord and their companion. For 10,000 years, the Custodes have stood guard over that shell. They are protecting the body of a being who can no longer acknowledge their presence or return their devotion. It is in some ways the loneliest duty in the galaxy, and the Custodes perform it without complaint, without hesitation, and without the faintest whisper of doubt about its importance, because the Emperor is still there, Behind the machinery and the psychic energy and the 10,000-year silence, he is still there, and as long as he endures, the Custodians will stand beside him. Let us also explore in greater depth the institution of the Companions, because this suborder of the Custodians represents the absolute pinnacle of custodian service and provides a window into the most sacred aspects of their duty. The Companions are the 300 custodians who serve as the Emperor's immediate bodyguard. They are the warriors who stand closest to the Golden Throne, who occupy the innermost rings of the palace's defenses, who form the final line of protection between the Emperor and any threat that has somehow managed to penetrate every other layer of the Custode's security apparatus. Selection as a companion is the highest honor that a custodian can receive, and it is not an honor that is sought or campaigned for. The Captain General selects the companions personally, choosing from among the entire body of the 10,000 based on criteria that are not publicly disclosed. What we know is that companions are chosen not merely for their martial prowess, which is exceptional even by custodian standards, but for something less tangible, a quality of character, a depth of devotion, a spiritual resonance with the Emperor's own nature that sets them apart from their already extraordinary peers. To be selected as a companion is to be acknowledged as the finest warrior in an organization composed entirely of the finest warriors in the galaxy. It is to be entrusted with a responsibility so sacred that failure is literally unthinkable, not improbable, not unlikely, unthinkable. The companion does not contemplate the possibility of failure because the possibility does not exist within their frame of reference. They will protect the Emperor or they will die. There is no third option. The companions serve in rotations, their vigils divided into periods of active guard duty and periods of rest, training, and preparation. But the concept of rest for a companion is relative. Even during their off-duty periods, Earth companions remain within the innermost precincts of the palace, ready to respond to any threat within seconds. They do not sleep in the way that ordinary humans sleep. Their enhanced biology requires only brief periods of unconsciousness, and even during these periods, their senses remain partially active, alert to any anomaly that might indicate a threat. The vigil of a companion is a profoundly solitary experience. They stand in silence, often for hours at a time, their senses extended to their maximum range, processing every sound, every scent, every vibration, every fluctuation in the ambient psychic energy of the palace. They are surrounded by the golden walls of the throne room, by the ornate architecture that celebrates the Emperor's glory, by the constant low hum of the Golden Throne's machinery, and by the overwhelming psychic presence of the Emperor himself, a presence that fills the room like heat from a furnace and that resonates with the spark of his power that burns within every custodian. What does a companion think about during those long hours of silent vigil? The lore does not tell us directly, and the companions themselves do not share their inner lives with outsiders. But we can infer from what we know of the custodian character that their thoughts are not idle. They are analyzing, evaluating, considering every possible threat, every conceivable scenario, every contingency that their immense intellect can devise. They are running tactical simulations in their minds, testing and refining the response plans that they have developed over centuries of service. They are listening, and not just with their ears, but with their entire being, to the subtle rhythms of the palace and the throne room, alert to any deviation from the established baseline that might signal danger. And they are, perhaps, in their own way, communing with the Emperor. The psychic presence of the Master of Mankind is overwhelming in the throne room, a force that ordinary humans cannot endure, and that even space marines find difficult to withstand for extended periods. But for the companions, who carry within them a spark of the Emperor's own power, that presence is something else entirely. It is a connection, a reminder of what they serve and why they serve it, a reinforcement of the purpose that defines their existence. As some accounts suggest that custodians who stand the companion's vigil for extended periods develop a kind of intuitive understanding of the Emperor's will, a sense of what he would want done in any given situation, that goes beyond mere analysis of his known preferences and stated intentions. Whether this represents genuine psychic communication or simply the result of centuries of proximity to the most powerful psyker in the galaxy, or merely the custodian's own projection of meaning onto a fundamentally unknowable phenomenon, is a question that the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. The story of Astor and Kalos, mentioned earlier in our discussion, is particularly illustrative. Kalos is described as having stood his companion's vigil for over 100 years without interruption. Only 100 years of standing in the presence of the Emperor, watching over his broken body, maintaining absolute readiness against threats that never materialized. The psychological toll of such a vigil is difficult to comprehend. The isolation alone would destroy most minds. The monotony would erode most wills. The constant proximity to the overwhelming psychic presence of the Emperor would overwhelm most psyches. But Kalos endured. He stood his vigil with the same unwavering dedication that he brought to his first day of service, and when he was finally relieved of his duty, he returned to the broader custodian community, having been changed by the experience in ways that his peers could recognize but not fully understand. Those who served alongside Kalos after his vigil described him as possessing a quality of certainty that was remarkable even by custodian standards, a sense of absolute clarity about his purpose and his place in the Emperor's design that seemed to radiate from him like light from a lantern. Was this the result of genuine communion with the Emperor? Or was it simply the natural consequence of a century spent in focused meditation on the meaning and purpose of his duty? The answer, like so many things about the Custodes, remains a mystery, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some truths are not meant to be fully understood. Some experiences are too profound and too personal to be reduced to simple explanations. The companion's vigil is one of those experiences, a sacred mystery at the heart of the most sacred duty in the Imperium. And now let us consider what the future holds for the Custodes as the 42nd millennium unfolds and the galaxy enters a period of unprecedented danger and uncertainty. The Great Rift, that vast wound in the fabric of reality that has split the galaxy in two, has changed the strategic landscape in ways that the Imperium is still struggling to comprehend. Entire sectors have been cut off from the light of the Astronomicon. Worlds that have been part of the Imperium for thousands of years now find themselves isolated, besieged by forces of chaos and Xenos alike, with no prospect of relief from the wider Imperium. The forces of the Dark Gods have grown stronger than they have been since the heresy itself, emboldened by the Rift's corrupting influence, and by the sense that the Imperium's days are numbered. In this new, more dangerous galaxy, the role of the Custodes has expanded beyond anything their founders could have anticipated. Under Trajan Valoris's leadership, as we discussed, the Golden Warriors have moved beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace and into the wider galaxy, striking at threats that the conventional forces of the Imperium cannot handle. Shield hosts now operate in war zones across the breadth of human space. Their golden armor, a beacon of hope for loyalist forces and a harbinger of doom for their enemies. But this expansion comes with risks. Every custodian deployed beyond the Sol system is a custodian who is not standing guard over the Emperor. Every shield host that ventures into the void is a force that cannot respond to threats closer to home. The Custodes are stretched thinner than they have been since the aftermath of the Webway War, and the threats they face are more numerous and more varied than ever before. The return of Robuta Guilliman has added another layer of complexity to the custodian situation. Guilliman is a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, a being of godlike power and intellect who has taken effective control of the Imperium as Lord Commander. The Custodes recognize his authority, but they do not subordinate themselves to it. They answer to the Emperor, and to the Emperor alone. Guilliman is aware of this, and he has been careful to work with the Custodes rather than attempting to command them. But the tension between the Primarch's authority and the Custodian's independence is a source of friction that has not been fully resolved, and that may never be. There is also the question of the Custodian's own future. So, the organization has endured for 10,000 years, but it is not immune to the passage of time. The knowledge required to create new custodians is held by a small number of generites whose art is passed down through lines of master and apprentice that stretch back to the founding of the Imperium. If that chain of knowledge is ever broken, if the generites ever lose the ability to create new custodians, the 10,000 will begin to dwindle, slowly over the course of millennia, but inevitably. And when the last custodian falls, the Emperor will be left without his golden guard for the first time in human history. This is a scenario that the Custodians work tirelessly to prevent. The generites are protected with the same ferocity that the Custodians bring to the defense of the Emperor himself. Their knowledge is preserved through multiple redundant systems. Their apprentices are trained with the same painstaking care that characterizes every aspect of custodian creation. But the vulnerability remains. In a galaxy where knowledge is fragile and the forces of destruction are relentless, the survival of a tradition that requires such specialized expertise can never be guaranteed. The Custodians know this. They plan for it. They prepare for the possibility that their numbers might one day be reduced to a point where they can no longer fulfill their duty in the way that it was originally conceived. Contingency plans exist for scenarios ranging from a minor reduction in force strength to the near-total elimination of the Custodians as a fighting force. These plans are classified at the highest possible level, what's known only to the Captain General and a handful of senior officers, but their existence speaks to the Custodian habit of planning for every possible eventuality, no matter how unlikely or how unpleasant. But the Custodians do not dwell on these dark possibilities. They do not allow the spectre of future failure to undermine their present performance. Each custodian focuses on the duty before them, the vigil they are currently standing, the threat they are currently neutralizing, the brother or sister they are currently fighting alongside. The future will come when it comes. What matters is the eternal now of service, the unbroken chain of moments in which the duty is performed and the Emperor is protected. The Unification Wars also deserve a more thorough examination, as because they were the crucible in which the Custodians were forged as an institution, and the lessons learned during that brutal conflict continue to shape custodian doctrine to this day. Before the Emperor revealed himself to humanity, Terra was a planet of warring nations, each one ruled by a techno-barbarian warlord, or a despotic king whose power was maintained through control of the remaining pre-age of strife technologies that still functioned on Earth's surface. These warlords fought constantly, using armies of genetically modified soldiers, cybernetic war machines, and weapons of devastating power to contest control of a world that had already been reduced to a scarred, polluted wasteland by millennia of conflict. The Emperor emerged from his long seclusion with the intention of unifying these warring factions under his banner, may by diplomacy where possible, and by force where necessary. The Thunder Warriors were his instrument for this task, created in haste and designed for aggression. They swept across Terra like a golden storm, crushing the armies of the techno-barbarians and bringing their territories under the Emperor's control. But the Custodians were there too, from the very beginning. While the Thunder Warriors were the hammer that shattered the enemy's forces, the Custodians were the shield that protected the Emperor's person and the scalpel that eliminated threats too subtle or too dangerous for the Thunder Warriors to handle. They accompanied the Emperor into negotiations with warlords who were considering surrender, their golden presence a reminder that resistance was futile and that the Emperor's patience was not unlimited. And they hunted down assassins and saboteurs who sought to end the unification by killing the Emperor before his vision could be realized. They fought in the most desperate battles, where the enemy's forces were strongest and the risk to the Emperor's person was greatest. The Unification Wars lasted for decades, and during that time, the Custodians honed their skills against every manner of opponent that Terra's war-torn surface could produce. Genetically enhanced berserkers who felt no pain and no fear. cybernetic war machines that could tear through reinforced ceramite like paper, psychers of terrifying power who could level entire fortifications with a single thought, chemical weapons that could dissolve organic matter in seconds, atomic devices that left nothing but glass and ash in their wake. Through it all, the Custodes adapted, learned, and evolved. Each enemy they faced taught them something new about the nature of warfare. Each battle refined their tactics and improved their equipment. By the time Terra was finally unified under the Emperor's rule, the Custodes had become the most experienced and capable fighting force that humanity had ever produced, tempered by decades of conflict against opponents who were often individually as powerful as they were and who always outnumbered them significantly. The final act of the unification wars, the culling of the Thunder Warriors, was a defining moment for the Custodes, and one that continues to resonate through their institutional culture to this day. The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose. They had conquered Terra, but they were unstable. Their genetic enhancements were degrading, causing physical and mental deterioration that made them increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. The Emperor, with characteristic pragmatism, decided that they had to be eliminated before they became a threat to the very civilization they had helped to build. The task fell to the Custodes. The details of the culling are not widely known, deliberately obscured by millennia of institutional secrecy and the natural desire to forget an episode that reflects uncomfortably on the nature of the Emperor's rule. What we do know is that the Custodes carried out the task with the same efficiency and ruthlessness that they brought to every other aspect of their duty. The Thunder Warriors, for all their power, were no match for the Golden Guard. They were hunted down and destroyed, their legacy erased from the official histories, and their names struck from the rolls of honor. The culling was not something the Custodes took pleasure in. The Thunder Warriors had been allies, comrades in arms who had fought beside the Custodes during the bloodiest conflicts of the Unification Wars. Many of them had earned the respect of individual custodians through acts of courage and sacrifice that were genuinely heroic. But the Emperor had spoken, and the Custodes obeyed, not blindly, not without understanding, but with the recognition that the Emperor's judgment in matters of humanity's survival was supreme, and that the welfare of the species took precedence over the lives of individuals, no matter how brave or how loyal those individuals might be. This willingness to execute difficult orders, to do what is necessary regardless of personal feelings or moral qualms, is a defining characteristic of the Custodian mentality. The Custodes are not automatons. They feel, they think, they question, but when the duty calls, they act, and they do not flinch from the consequences of their actions because they understand that the stakes are too high and the margin for error too slim to allow for the luxury of hesitation. It is a hard philosophy, a cold philosophy by some standards. But it is the philosophy that has kept the Emperor alive for 10,000 years, that has preserved the Imperium through crises that would have destroyed any lesser civilization, and that continues to drive the Golden Warriors forward into an uncertain future with the same unwavering determination that they brought to their first battle so many millennia ago. Then let us now draw all of these threads together and consider the full picture of what it means to become a custodian. We have talked about the selection, the transformation, the training, the weapons and armor, the traditions and organizational structure, the daily life and the eventual retirement. We have explored the history, from the Unification Wars to the Horus Heresy to the era Indomitus. We have examined the philosophy, the mindset, the relationship with the Emperor and with the rest of the Imperium. What emerges from all of this is not simply the portrait of a warrior, though the Custodes are certainly that. What emerges is the portrait of a being who has been crafted down to the cellular level to embody the concept of duty. Not duty as an abstract principle or a moral obligation, but duty as a state of being, and as fundamental to the custodian's nature as breathing or heartbeat. The custodian does not perform their duty. they are their duty. The distinction between the warrior and the purpose is dissolved until the two become one and the same. This is what the Emperor created when he designed the Custodians, not just super soldiers, not just bodyguards, not just companions, though they were all of those things. He created a proof of concept, a demonstration that it was possible to create a human being whose dedication to a cause was so complete, so total, so fundamentally woven into every aspect of their being, that nothing in the universe could shake it. Not the passage of time, not the corrupting influence of chaos, not the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of suffering and loss, and witnessing the slow, agonizing decline of the civilization they were created to protect. The Custodians have watched the Imperium crumble around them. They have seen the Emperor's grand vision devolve into a nightmare of bureaucratic incompetence, religious fanaticism, and perpetual war. They have stood guard while the very people they protect slide deeper and deeper into the kind of ignorance and superstition that the Emperor sought to eliminate. They have endured all of this, and they have not broken. They have not faltered. They have not questioned their purpose or their duty. They have simply continued to serve, day after day, century after century, millennium after millennium, with the same unwavering dedication that they brought to their first day of active service. That is not merely impressive. That is awe-inspiring. In a universe defined by its capacity to corrupt, to break, to wear down even the strongest wills and the noblest intentions, the Custodians stand as proof that some things endure, that some commitments once made cannot be unmade, that there exists, somewhere in the human soul, a capacity for devotion that transcends all of the suffering and corruption and despair that the universe can throw at it. And all of it begins with an infant, a child, taken from its family before it can even form the memories that would define a normal human life, subjected to decades of agonizing transformation that will either kill them or remake them into something almost unrecognizable as the human being they might have been. A child who will never know what it is like to grow up normally, to play, to make friends, to fall in love, is to experience any of the countless small joys and sorrows that make a human life worth living. A child who will instead know only duty, only service, only the golden weight of a responsibility so vast that it encompasses the survival of the entire human species. Is this a blessing or a curse? The question cannot be answered, because the beings who might answer it are the very ones who have been shaped to view their existence as the only possible life worth living. A Custodian does not mourn the childhood they never had. They do not wonder what might have been if they had been left with their family, allowed to grow up as a normal human, to live and love and die in the span of a single mortal lifetime. These questions do not arise, because the person who might have asked them was erased during the transformation, replaced by something that simply does not have the capacity to question its own existence in that way. Or does it? The law is deliberately ambiguous on this point. The Custodians are presented as beings of exceptional intellect and philosophical depth, capable of engaging with abstract concepts and moral questions at a level that far exceeds most space marines. Is it possible that some Custodians, in the quiet hours of their eternal vigil, do contemplate the nature of their existence? Do they wonder what it would be like to be free of the duty that defines them? Do they look at the mortal humans around them with their messy, complicated, gloriously imperfect lives and feel something that might be envy? We do not know. The Custodians are not given to sharing their inner lives with outsiders. But the mere possibility that such questions might arise makes them more human, not less. It suggests that beneath the golden armor and the transhuman physiology and the millennia of conditioning, there is still something recognizably human at the core of every Custodian. Something that the bioalchemy could not erase and that the decades of training could not overwrite. Something that endures, quiet and persistent, like a candle flame in a cathedral, too small to illuminate the vast darkness, but too stubborn to be extinguished. And perhaps that is the most extraordinary thing about the Custodians. Not their physical power, not their political authority, not their golden armor or their legendary weapons or their 10,000-year history of unbroken service, but the fact that, after everything that has been done to them, and after everything they have been through, after everything they have seen and suffered and endured, they are still, at some fundamental level, human. Different from any other humans who have ever existed. Enhanced beyond all recognition. Transformed at the cellular level into something that stands on the boundary between mortal and divine, but human. Still human. And it is that humanity, that irreducible core of human identity that persists, despite all efforts to enhance or replace it, that makes the Custodians what they are. Not just the most powerful warriors in the galaxy, but the most devoted servants, the most faithful guardians, the most enduring expression of a promise made 10,000 years ago by a being who believed that humanity was worth saving and who created in his own image warriors who would never, ever stop trying to save it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The laughter of thirsting gods echoes across the void. Worlds burn. Species are extinguished. The great game of survival plays out across 1,000,000 battlefields under alien stars, and the blood of the fallen feeds the hungry earth of 1,000 war-torn planets. But in the heart of the Imperium, in the vast echoing halls of the Imperial Palace, the Golden Warriors stand their eternal vigil. They have stood there for 10,000 years. They will stand there for 10,000 more, and 10,000 after that, and 10,000 after that. For as long as the Emperor endures, for as long as the Golden Throne burns with the fading light of humanity's last hope, for as long as there is a duty to perform and a threat to guard against. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own, and the weight of gold has never felt lighter. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the lore of the Adeptus Custodes, and if the journey we have taken together through the creation, the history, and the philosophy of these golden warriors has left you wanting more, then please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what makes videos like this possible, and it means more to me than I can properly express. Every subscription, every like, every comment helps the channel grow and ensures that I can continue bringing you the kind of deep, immersive lore content that we all love. If there is a topic you would like me to cover in a future video, is something that has caught your imagination, or that you think deserves the kind of thorough exploration we have given the Custodians today, please leave your suggestions in the comments below. I read every single one, and your ideas are the lifeblood of this channel. Together, we have built something special here, a community of people who share a love for the deep, rich, endlessly fascinating lore of the 41st millennium. And I am grateful every day for the chance to be a part of it. Until next time, may the Emperor's light guide your path through the darkness. May your vigil be long and your duty clear. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the smallest light can hold back the endless night. Stay golden.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.